Well, howdy, partner. Name's Eureka Earl, and I thank you kindly for stopping by Guns and Nuggets. Round these parts, we spin tales where gold was struck, guns were drawn, and legends made. If this here story tickles your fancy, don't be shy. Tip your hat with a like, hitch your wagon with a subscribe, and tell your trail mates. Plenty more tales are waiting. Well now, settle in close to the fire, friend. Name's Earl, and I got me a story tonight that'll make you think twice before you go digging where you ain't supposed to dig. Stories like this one, they tend to stick to your ribs like bad whiskey, cold and unsettling, lingering long after you wish they'd leave you be. If you're new to these fireside tales, welcome. If you've been here before, you know what's coming, the kind of story that makes you check over your shoulder when you walk out to the woodpile after dark. If you like what you hear, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this with someone who appreciates a good yarn spun proper. We're keeping these old Western tales alive, one campfire at a time. Now then, out past the ruins of Sable Creek, where the buildings lean like old men remembering better days, there's a field. Ain't much to look at, just scrub grass and alkali dust, a few scattered stones that might have been foundations once. Maybe a rusted wheel rim half buried in the sand. The kind of place you'd ride through without a second glance, heading somewhere else, anywhere else, because there ain't nothing there worth stopping for, except for the tree. It stands alone in the middle of that empty field, and once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. Can't forget it neither. It's a cottonwood, thick as three men standing shoulder to shoulder, with bark so dark it looks like it's been scorched by more than just the desert sun. The branches twist up toward the sky like gnarled fingers reaching for something they'll never touch, and the trunk tells stories all its own. Scars, deep grooves worn into the wood, smoothed by time and wind but still visible if you look close. Rope marks, the kind that come from hemp pulled tight, swinging heavy with weight it was never meant to carry. Weight that struggled, weight that went still. They called it the Gallows tree. Still do, the few folks who remember. The ones old enough to have heard the stories from their granddaddies, who heard them from theirs. The tree's been standing there since before Sable Creek was anything more than a water stop and a tent saloon. Been standing through boom times and bust, through gold strikes and Indian raids, through all the violence and hope and heartbreak that the frontier could throw at it. But it earned its name honest, earned it in rope and gravity, and the justice, if you can call it that men used to dispense out here when the nearest real law was 3 days' ride away and getting farther every time you needed it. Men died on that tree, died slow, kicking at the air, while crowds watched and some cheered and others looked away because even frontier justice can turn a man's stomach if he's got any conscience left. Rustlers hung there, claim jumpers, murderers and thieves and men who just happened to be in the wrong place when the wrong crowd got worked up enough to need a hanging. The tree took them all, didn't judge, didn't refuse, just stood there solid and silent while men did what men do when they're scared or angry or convinced they're right. And after each hanging, after the body got cut down and buried or burned or just left for the buzzards depending on how the crowd felt about him, the tree kept standing, kept growing, kept adding rings to its trunk, one for each year, same as any tree does. But this tree's different. You can feel it when you get close. Feel it in your bones, in the way the air gets heavy, in how the birds don't sing near it and the coyotes won't den under its roots. There's a wrongness to it, a weight that ain't natural. Maybe it's just superstition. Maybe it's the knowledge of what happened there, the history soaked into the wood and the ground beneath it. Or maybe, and this is what the old-timers will tell you when they've had enough whiskey to loosen their tongues, maybe some trees remember. Maybe violence leaves a mark deeper than rope scars, and maybe that tree absorbed every bit of fear and pain and desperation that got strung up in its branches. The ground around it's hard-packed and pale, like nothing wants to grow there. No grass except the tough alkali kind that'll grow anywhere. No flowers, no bushes, nothing soft or living. Just that tree standing alone and empty, the ground, casting a shadow that seems too dark for the angle of the sun, stretching too far, lasting too long after sunset. Folks used to say it was the last stop before judgment. A man could be riding free one day, and the next he'd be standing under those branches with his hands tied and a preacher reading scripture that didn't seem to apply to him no matter how hard the words tried. Some men went quiet, some cried, some cursed God and the crowd and every lawman who ever drew breath, and some, this is the part that'll make your skin prickle, some laughed. Laughed because they knew something nobody else did. Laughed because they'd hidden something, buried something, stashed something away where no one would ever think to look. What better hiding place than under a gallows tree? What better insurance against grave robbers and claim jumpers and curious townsfolk than the knowledge that to dig there you'd have to disturb ground where the executed lay, where the rope-marked dead went into the earth still wearing the memory of their final dance? That's where the legend started. Whispers that turned into stories that turned into accepted fact, whether it was true or not. Gold buried under the gallows tree, hidden by outlaws who knew they were caught, who knew the rope was waiting, who decided that if they couldn't spend it, nobody else would either. They'd take that secret to their graves that just happened to be dug at the base of the very tree they'd hang from. Poetic, in a dark kind of way, practical too, if you think about it. A man facing the noose ain't got many cards left to play, but he's got one. He can make sure his enemies don't profit from his death. Can make sure whatever he stole or earned or killed for stays right where he put it, guarded by superstition and fear and the simple human reluctance to dig where the dead are buried. So the gold stayed there, if it ever was there. Year after year, that tree stood and the stories grew, and men would ride past and wonder and speculate and argue about whether it was real. But nobody dug, nobody even got close with a shovel, because there's things you just don't do out here, and disturbing the ground beneath a hanging tree is pretty high on that list. The wind's picking up now, coming cold off the desert, carrying that particular chill that makes you pull your coat tighter even when the fire's burning good. Somewhere in the darkness beyond our little circle of light, something moves. Could be a rabbit, could be nothing. Could be the kind of thing that makes a man glad he's got company and firelight between him and the night. That tree's still standing out there in that empty field, still alone, still scarred, still casting its too long shadow. And under its roots, they say, gold sleeps. Gold that's been waiting there for decades, maybe longer. Gold that's seen men hang and heard their last words and felt the thump when their bodies hit the end of the rope. But gold ain't the only thing that sleeps under that tree. The men who buried it are there too, some of them anyway. The ones who got caught before they could run, before they could spend it, before they could do anything except watch the rope go around their necks and wonder if it had all been worth it. They're down there in the dark, mixed with the dirt and the roots, and some folks say they're still guarding what they hid, still watching, still waiting for someone foolish enough or desperate enough to try and take what they died protecting. This here's a story about gold and greed, about justice and vengeance, about the line between legend and truth and how sometimes that line gets blurry as desert heat shimmer. It's about three men who thought they were clever, about the treasure they buried, about the rope that found them anyway. And it's about all the fools who came after, who heard the stories and thought they'd be the exception, thought they'd be the ones to dig up that gold and walk away, rich. Most of them did walk away, some didn't walk at all, and a few just disappeared, leaving nothing but a shovel stuck in the ground and tracks that stopped cold at the base of that tree, like the earth itself had swallowed them up. The gallows tree, standing alone in an empty field at the edge of a ghost town, its branches still strong enough to bear weight, its shadow still dark enough to hide secrets. And under its roots, they say, gold waits in the darkness, gold that remembers the hands that buried it, gold that carries the stain of the blood spilled to get it. Some fortunes are meant to be found, some are meant to stay buried, and some will reach up from the ground and drag you down with them if you're fool enough to go digging. The fire's crackling good now, throwing sparks up into the night sky where they mix with the stars and disappear. The coffee's strong and the night's long, and I got me a tale to tell. A tale about 3 outlaws and a train robbery, about gold buried in cursed ground, about a tree that remembers every man who ever hung from it. A tale about the price of greed and the weight of guilt, and what happens when you dig where the dead don't want to be disturbed. So, pour yourself another cup, friend, pull your blanket closer, and listen while I tell you about the gallows tree and the gold that should have stayed buried, about the men who hid it there, the men who died trying to take it, and the tree that stands watch over it all, waiting patient as death itself for the next fool to come digging. Because there's always a next fool, always someone who thinks they're smarter than the ones who came before, someone who thinks the rules don't apply to them, someone who looks at that tree and sees dollar signs instead of warning signs. And that tree, it's patient. It's got all the time in the world. It'll be standing there long after we're dust, still guarding its secrets, still waiting, still remembering. The shadows hang low tonight, friend, real low. And if you listen careful, if you quiet your breathing and still your heart, you might hear it distant and faint but unmistakable. The creak of rope in a windless night, the sound of something swinging slow beneath old branches, the whisper of men long dead, still guarding what they buried, still warning off the living, still hungry for company under the roots of the gallows tree. Now, to understand how gold ended up buried under a hanging tree, you gotta go back to the spring of 1881, when Sable Creek was more than just ruins and memories. Back when it was a proper town, not big, mind you, but alive. 2 saloons, a general store, a livery stable, a bank that only opened 3 days a week because there wasn't enough business to justify more. Maybe 300 souls called it home, most of them involved in mining one way or another, either pulling silver out of the hills or selling supplies to the men who did. The town sat in a valley between 2 ridges of red rock, with a creek running through it that gave the place its name. Sable Creek, named for the dark sand in the stream bed, sand that looked black when it was wet, that folks thought might be valuable until they realized it was just regular sand stained by minerals leaching out of the hills. But the name stuck, and so did the town, at least for a while. It was the kind of place you'd find all over the frontier in those days. Rough but not lawless, poor but hopeful, populated by men trying to make something of themselves and women trying to make something of the men. Church on Sundays, hanging on Tuesdays if the circuit judge happened to be around. Life was hard but simple, and most folks were content with that. Then the outlaws came. 3 of them rode into Sable Creek on a Tuesday morning in April. Came in from the east, their horses lathered and blowing hard like they'd been ridden through the night. They tied up outside the first saloon, McGinty's it was called, and went inside without a word to anyone on the street. Names were Mason Cord, Ezra Cutter, and a fellow everyone called Briggs, though nobody knew if that was his first name or last. They'd been running together for near about 3 years, making a name for themselves from Texas to Colorado, robbing stagecoaches and small-town banks, never taking enough to bring the serious law down on them, but taking enough to live comfortable between jobs. Mason was the leader, or as much of a leader as 3 men like that could have. Tall fellow, thin as a whip, with eyes that never stopped moving, always watching, always calculating. He wore his gun low and tied down, and the way he walked told you he knew how to use it. Had killed 3 men in fair fights, or as fair as fights ever are, and probably more that weren't so fair. But he was smart, which made him dangerous in ways that went beyond just being fast with a pistol. Cutter was the muscle, short and broad, with hands like ham hocks and a face that looked like it had stopped a few too many fists over the years. He didn't talk much, didn't need to. When Mason needed someone convinced or someone hurt, Cutter did the convincing and the hurting, simple as that. He carried a big Sharps rifle that he could use to knock a man off his horse at 300 yards, and a knife with a blade near about long as your forearm. The knife's what earned him his name. Cutter, though, there were stories about how he'd earned it that'd turn your stomach if you heard them told proper. Briggs was the puzzle. Young fellow, maybe 25, with a baby face that made him look even younger. Dressed neat, spoke educated, could have passed for a bank clerk or a school teacher if you didn't know better. But he had a mean streak in him that ran deep as a mine shaft, and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He was good with numbers, good with planning, and good at killing when it needed doing. Some said he'd been a bookkeeper back east before he killed his employer over a woman, but out west nobody asked too many questions about a man's past. You were what you were right now, and right now Briggs was an outlaw. They'd been lying low after a robbery down in Socorro, waiting for things to cool off, when they heard about the payroll train. Information came from a telegrapher in Santa Fe who liked whiskey more than he liked his job, who mentioned that the mining company was sending 3 months' worth of wages to their operation up north, traveling by rail because they figured it was safer than stagecoach. $40,000 in gold coin, packed in strong boxes, guarded by exactly 2 railroad agents who probably couldn't hit a barn from inside it. The train would pass through a stretch of empty country on Thursday evening, slow down for a grade, and be vulnerable as a newborn calf. Mason heard that information and saw opportunity. Cutter heard it and saw easy money. Briggs heard it and started making calculations: how much gold weighs, how many coins you can fit in a saddlebag, how far you can ride before the horses give out. They planned it careful. Spent 2 days riding the route, finding the best spot for an ambush. Settled on a place where the tracks cut through a narrow canyon, where the train would have to slow almost to a crawl to make the grade. Perfect setup, rocks above to give them cover and high ground, no way for the train to speed up or turn around, just that slow chug through the canyon while they took what they wanted. Thursday evening came with a sky gone red and gold, the kind of sunset that makes you believe the world's painted just for your pleasure. The 3 outlaws waited among the rocks above the tracks, their horses tied back in a draw where they wouldn't spook at the noise. Mason checked his pistol for the 10th time. Cutter cradled his sharps like it was a child. Briggs sat calm and still, watching the empty tracks, waiting. They heard the train before they saw it. That particular sound of steam and steel, the chuff, chuff, chuff of the engine laboring up the grade, the screech of metal wheels on metal rails. Then it came into view, exactly on schedule, exactly where they expected it. Mason let it get halfway through the canyon before he fired the first shot, not at anyone, just into the air. The signal to stop. The train didn't stop. The engineer probably figured it was just cowboys having fun or Indians taking pot shots, and he kept that train chugging along. So Cutter put a bullet through the smokestack. The sharps boomed like thunder in that canyon, and the bullet punched through the metal with a sound like a church bell getting hit with a hammer. That got the engineer's attention. He pulled that brake lever so hard you could hear it scream, and the train ground to a halt with sparks flying from the wheels and steam hissing out everywhere. What happened next? Well, it went fast. Mason and Briggs scrambled down from the rocks, while Cutter kept his rifle trained on the engine. The 2 railroad guards came out of the mail car, ready to make a fight of it, but one look at Cutter's sharps pointing at them and they reconsidered. Smart men. They put their hands up and didn't make any trouble while Mason and Briggs went to work on the strong boxes. Took them maybe 10 minutes to load the gold into the saddlebags they'd brought. $40,000 in coin weighs near about 400 pounds, and they'd planned for that. Brought extra bags and extra rope and made sure their horses were fresh and strong. The passengers stayed in their car. Nobody wanted to be a hero for the railroad's money. The engineer and fireman stayed in the engine. The guards kept their hands up, and the outlaws worked quick and efficient, like men who'd done this before. When the bags were loaded and the gold was secure, Mason tipped his hat to the guards. "Appreciate your cooperation, gentlemen. You boys have a safe trip." Now. Then they mounted up and rode west, into the setting sun, with 400 pounds of stolen gold and the knowledge that they'd just pulled off the biggest robbery of their careers. They rode hard that night, putting distance between themselves and the train, between themselves and the law that would surely come looking. By midnight they were 30 miles away, their horses stumbling with exhaustion, and they needed to stop, needed to rest, needed to think, needed to figure out what came next. Because stealing $40,000 is one thing, Keeping it is another. Spending it without getting caught is something else entirely. They made camp in a dry wash, no fire, just cold beans and water from their canteens. And they talked about what to do with the gold. Couldn't carry it all, not if they needed to ride fast. Couldn't spend it locally, not without drawing attention. Couldn't split up without risking one of them taking more than his share or running to the law for the reward. That's when Briggs mentioned Sable Creek. Small town, not much law presence, and more importantly, it had a bank. They could hide most of the gold, keep just enough for traveling money, and come back for it when things cooled off. Split it proper, each man getting his fair share, all civilized and organized. Mason liked the idea. Cutter didn't care as long as he got his money eventually. So they rode for Sable Creek, arrived Tuesday morning, like I said, and immediately started looking for a place to stash their fortune. That's when they saw the tree, the Gallows tree, standing alone in that empty field at the edge of town. And Mason, being Mason, saw the poetry in it, saw the perfect hiding place, because who in their right mind would dig under a hanging tree? Who'd disturb ground that soaked up the fear and the death of every man who'd swung from those branches? They waited until full dark that Tuesday night, brought shovels they'd bought at the general store, told the clerk these were prospecting, rode out to that tree with their saddlebags full of stolen gold, and they started digging. The ground was hard desert soil packed solid by sun and time, but they were motivated, and fear's a hell of a shovel. They dug deep, maybe 6 feet down, in the shadow of that tree's thick roots, and they laughed while they did it, laughed at their own cleverness, at the law that would never think to look here, at the fortune they'd buried where the dead lay. Mason said, and this got remembered because someone heard him say it later, nobody's gonna dig where the rope-scarred dead swing. This gold'll be safer here than in any bank vault. They covered their hole careful, smoothed the dirt, scattered rocks and brush to hide the fresh digging. Took one of Briggs's careful maps and tore it in half, one half showing how to find Sable Creek from the main road, the other half showing where exactly under the tree the gold was buried. Each man took a piece, insurance that they'd all have to come back together to claim their fortune. Then they went back to town, back to McGinty's saloon, and they drank to their success. Drank to being rich men, drank to the gold, sleeping safe under the gallows tree while they figured out their next move. But here's the thing about stealing gold, it makes noise. $40,000 going missing from a payroll train, that gets telegrams sent, that gets wanted posters printed, that gets sheriffs and marshals and railroad detectives all working the same case, all looking for 3 men who match a certain description, all following the same trail that led straight to Sable Creek. By Wednesday morning, the law was already closing in. The sheriff from the county seat rode into town with a telegraph in his hand and a description of 3 outlaws who'd robbed a train. He showed it to the marshal in Sable Creek, a fellow named Hewitt, who was getting too old for the job but hadn't figured out how to retire yet. Marshal, Hewitt took one look at that description and knew exactly who it was talking about. Those 3 strangers who'd ridden in the day before, the ones drinking heavy at McGinty's, the ones who didn't look like miners or merchants or anything legitimate. He'd had a bad feeling about them from the start, and now he knew why. By Thursday morning, they had the town surrounded, not just Marshal Hewitt, but the county sheriff and 6 deputies, all armed and determined. They'd waited until the outlaws were hung over and off their guard, until the saloon had opened for breakfast and the 3 men were inside eating and probably planning their next move. The sheriff kicked in the door and shouted for them to surrender. For about 3 seconds it looked like maybe they would. Then Mason reached for his gun and everything went to hell. The gunfight lasted maybe 2 minutes but felt like 2 hours. Bullets flying, wood splintering, men shouting and cursing and diving for cover. When the smoke cleared, Cutter was dead, took 3 bullets to the chest and went down hard. Mason was wounded in the shoulder but still alive, still fighting until they beat him down with rifle butts. And Briggs had made it to the back door, had almost made it through, when a deputy's bullet caught him in the leg and dropped him. They dragged Mason and Briggs out into the street, both bleeding, both in chains. Cutter they left where he fell. He wasn't going anywhere. The crowd gathered, that particular mob mentality that takes over when there's blood in the water and justice to be dispensed. Marshal Hewitt searched them right there in the street, found about $300 between the two of them, traveling money, spending money, just enough to raise suspicion, but not nearly enough to be the $40,000 they'd stolen. He asked them where the rest was, asked them loud enough for the crowd to hear. Mason spat blood and grinned. Gone, spent, in the wind. You'll never find it, Briggs said. Nothing. Just stood there bleeding and staring at that tree visible beyond the edge of town, that big dark cottonwood standing alone. His face said everything his mouth wouldn't. The circuit judge was in town, pure luck or pure fate, depending on how you see it. He held court that very afternoon in the saloon, with Mason and Briggs standing before him in chains, the evidence laid out clear as day. Stolen gold, dead lawmen in the gunfight, train robbery, resisting arrest, open and shut. The judge sentenced them both to hang, sentenced to be carried out the next morning, Friday, at dawn. And the gallows? Well, there was only one tree in Sable Creek strong enough and old enough to do the job proper. The gallows tree would earn its name one more time. That night in the jail cell, the two outlaws had one last conversation. Marshal Hewitt heard some of it, told folks later what was said. Mason was scared. You could hear it in his voice, that particular sound a man makes when he knows tomorrow the sun rises without him. He asked Briggs about the maps, about the gold, about whether anyone would ever find it. Briggs laughed, actually laughed, soft and bitter. We buried it in the only place no one will ever look, under our own gallows. How's that for irony? One of us has to survive, Mason said. Has to get word out, has to make sure somebody gets it eventually. Nobody's surviving tomorrow, Briggs replied. We're both dancing at the end of a rope come sunrise. But Briggs was wrong about that, because that night, late, when the marshal was dozing and the town was dark and quiet, Mason did something desperate. Used a piece of wire he'd hidden in his boot to pick the lock on his cell. Made it out through the window, started running. He almost made it to the horses, almost made it out of town, almost made it to freedom and that gold buried under the tree. But the marshal woke up, heard the commotion, and raised the alarm. They caught Mason at the edge of town, right near that tree, ironically enough. Shot him when he wouldn't stop running. Not fatal, but enough to drop him. Come morning, they had Mason under the tree, rope around his neck, standing on a barrel. The whole town turned out to watch. Briggs was supposed to hang too, but sometime in the night he'd managed to bite through his own wrists, not cut, bite, and bled out quiet in his cell. Cheated the rope, but not death. So it was just Mason, standing there under those twisted branches, looking down at the ground where his fortune was buried, knowing he'd never spend a dime of it. The preacher read scripture. The marshal asked if he had any last words. Mason looked out at the crowd, at the hard faces and the curious children and the women who wouldn't meet his eyes, and he smiled. Blood on his teeth from where they'd hit him, but he smiled anyway. Gold's buried, he said. Close enough to touch, far enough to matter. Y'all can dig for it if you want, dig up this whole field, but I promise you this, whoever finds it will wish they hadn't. Some treasures carry weight that ain't measured in coin. Some fortunes cost more than they're worth. Then the marshal kicked the barrel out from under him, and Mason Cord danced his last dance at the end of a rope, 6 feet above $40,000 in stolen gold. They buried him right there, at the base of the tree. Didn't even bother with a coffin, just wrapped him in canvas and dropped him in a hole. Briggs went into the ground next to him, and Cutter got planted somewhere on the other side. 3 graves at the base of the gallows tree, 3 outlaws gone to their judgment, and $40,000 in gold sleeping under their bones. The town talked about digging for it, talked about it for weeks, but nobody did, because Mason's last words had weight to them, had the sound of truth or curse or both, and because the ground under a hanging tree ain't ground you disturb unless you're desperate or foolish or both. So the gold stayed there, the tree kept standing, the seasons turned, And Sable Creek kept on living, and the legend of the buried treasure started to grow. 3 outlaws, 1 train robbery, 1 hanging, and a fortune hidden where the dead men lay. That's how it started. That's the spark that lit a fire that's still burning all these years later. Gold under the gallows tree, waiting in the darkness, guarded by men who died protecting it, cursed by last words spoken with a rope around a neck. The law never found it. The railroad detectives gave up looking, and the gold stayed buried, waiting for the next chapter of the story, waiting for the fool who'd be desperate enough or greedy enough to dig where the rope-scarred dead swing. That fool was coming. He just didn't know it yet. Years passed different in desert country. The sun's so fierce and the wind so constant that time gets weathered down, same as everything else. Buildings, people, memories, all of it worn smooth and faded until you can't quite remember how things used to be. The sharp edges get rounded off, the colors bleach out, and what's left is just the bones of things, the basic shape without the details that made them real. That's what happened to Sable Creek. The silver played out first. The mines that had drawn men to these hills in the first place, they ran dry or ran too deep or just stopped being worth the effort. One by one, the miners packed up and left, following rumors of strikes in Nevada or Montana or anywhere that promised a better chance than what they had here. The mining company closed its operation in 1887, and that was the beginning of the end. The businesses followed. Can't run a general store when there's nobody to buy from it. Can't keep a saloon open when there's nobody to drink in it. McGinty's closed in '88, the church in '89, the bank never really bothered opening after the mine shut down. Families left for California or back east or just anywhere else, loading their belongings onto wagons and taking their chances on the road because staying put seemed like slower dying. By 1895, Sable Creek was more ghost than town. Maybe 20 people still living there, stubborn old-timers who didn't have anywhere else to go or didn't want to admit defeat. The building stood empty, windows broken, doors hanging crooked, the desert slowly reclaiming what men had built. Tumbleweeds piled up against walls, lizards made homes in abandoned stoves. The wind played lonely songs through empty rooms. But the tree, the gallows tree, it kept standing, kept growing, even, added rings to its trunk, sent its roots deeper, spread its branches wider. It was the one constant in a changing landscape, the one thing that seemed immune to the decay eating everything else. Maybe that's because death don't decay. Death just is, permanent as stone, patient as time. Folks who passed through Sable Creek on their way to somewhere else, they'd see that tree and wonder about it. Something about it stood out, drew the eye, made you want to look even when you didn't want to see. The bark was darker than any cottonwood had a right to be. The branches twisted in ways that seemed almost deliberate, almost purposeful. And those rope scars, they were still visible, deep grooves worn into the wood like the tree was keeping score. The stories kept circulating too, passed from one traveler to another, told in saloons and mining camps and anywhere men gathered to trade tales. The story of the 3 outlaws and the buried gold. The story of Mason Cord's last words. The story of $40,000 sleeping under cursed ground. Most folks dismissed it as legend. Had to be legend, right? Because if it was true, somebody would have dug it up by now. Somebody would have gotten desperate enough or greedy enough to risk whatever curse might be attached to that gold. The fact that the tree still stood and the ground looked undisturbed, that proved it was just a story, just folklore, just the kind of tale men tell to make boring country seem more interesting. But some folks believed. Some folks heard that story and saw possibility, saw 40,000 reasons to test whether the curse was real. And one of those folks was a man named Abel Thatcher. His full name was, though he hadn't used the last name in years, just went by Abel, like he was trying to shed his history, same as a snake sheds skin. He was 63 years old in the summer of 1895, looked 73, and felt 93. The prospecting life had used him up, hard years of digging in the sun, sleeping rough, eating worse, drinking whatever he could find to take the edge off the loneliness. He'd come west young and idealistic, same as 1,000 other men, thinking he'd strike it rich and return home triumphant. That was 40 years ago, and he was still out here, still looking, still chasing the dream that was always just one more claim away. He'd found enough over the years to keep hope alive, a little color here, a decent pocket there, once a vein that paid out $300 before it pinched off to nothing, but never the big strike, never the mother lode, never enough to quit and go home. Not that he had a home to go back to. His wife had divorced him in 1870, tired of waiting for a man who loved rocks more than he loved her. His children, 3 of them, last he knew, had grown up without him, probably didn't even remember what he looked like. His parents were dead, his siblings scattered, his youth wasted in holes in the ground that never paid out like they promised. Now he was old and broke and tired, limping on a leg that had never healed right after a cave-in back in '87. He had a mule that was as worn out as he was, a pick and shovel that were more rust than metal, and exactly $7.35 to his name. He needed one last score, one big find to set him up for whatever years he had left, one piece of luck before. His own luck ran out. That's when he heard about the Gallows tree gold. He was in a saloon in Deming, New Mexico, drinking cheap whiskey and listening to miners talk. The conversation turned to lost treasures and hidden loot, the way it always does when men are drinking and dreaming. Somebody mentioned the Sable Creek robbery, the 3 outlaws, the buried gold. Most of the men laughed it off, old story, probably not true, definitely not findable after all these years. But an old Mexican man sitting in the corner, he spoke up, said his brother had worked as a deputy in Sable Creek back in the day, had been there for the hanging, said Mason Cord really had buried the gold under the tree, and his brother had watched where they dug. Said the gold was real and it was still there, because nobody was crazy enough to dig under a gallows tree. Cursed ground, the old man said, crossing himself. The dead don't share. You dig there, you wake them up, and they don't like being woken. Most of the men in the saloon laughed at that too. Superstitious Mexican nonsense, they said. Ignorant peasant beliefs. But Abel didn't laugh. He sat there nursing his whiskey, thinking hard, because he was desperate enough not to care about curses and old enough not to believe in much except gravity and greed. After the saloon closed, Abel found the old Mexican outside, asked him more about the tree. The man was reluctant to talk, kept crossing himself and muttering prayers, but Abel had $3 left, and the old man had a thirst, and money talks louder than superstition most days. The man drew him a map on the back of an old newspaper, showed him how to find Sable Creek, how to recognize the tree, and then, and this is what made Abel's heart beat faster, he pulled out a scrap of paper, yellowed and brittle with age. Said his brother had taken it off Briggs's body after he died in the cell. It was half a map, torn clean down the middle, the half that showed where under the tree the gold was buried. This half shows the spot, the old man said. The other half shows how to find the town from the main road. But you don't need that, I just drew you that part. This paper, this will show you exactly where to dig. But I'm warning you, Senor, leave it buried. Some fortunes aren't worth finding. Abel bought the map fragment for his last $3. Didn't even haggle, because if this was real, if the gold was really there, $3 was the best investment he'd ever make. And if it wasn't real, well, he'd wasted money on dumber things. He left Deming the next morning, heading north and west toward Sable Creek. Took him 4 days to get there, riding slow because his mule was old and he wasn't in much better shape. 4 days of desert heat and rationed water and thinking about gold. $40,000. Even split 3 ways it would be. No, wait. The outlaws were dead. He wouldn't have to split it with anyone. It was all his. $40,000, all his. Enough to set him up comfortable for whatever time he had left. He reached Sable Creek on a Thursday afternoon, the sun already low and the shadows getting long. The town was worse than he'd expected, more abandoned than inhabited, more bones than body. But the tree was exactly where the old Mexican had said it would be, standing in that empty field at the edge of town, dark and massive and unmistakable. Abel made camp in one of the abandoned buildings, the old livery stable, still mostly standing, with half a roof and 3 walls. He didn't want to draw attention, didn't want the few remaining townspeople to know what he was doing. So he waited for dark, checking the map fragment by firelight, memorizing the marks that would show him where to dig. The map was detailed, showed the tree from above, marked with an X about 6 feet from the trunk on the north side, noted that the gold was buried 6 feet deep, wrapped in canvas and leather, protected from the elements. Professional work. The map. The kind of thing a careful criminal would make to ensure he could find his fortune again. Abel lay in his bedroll that night, listening to the desert sounds, thinking about tomorrow, thinking about the gold. $40,000 in coin, just waiting under the dirt. He tried not to think about the men who'd buried it, the men who'd died protecting it. Tried not to think about curses or warnings or the old Mexican crossing himself and muttering prayers. But he couldn't help thinking about it a little. Couldn't help wondering why, if the gold was really there, nobody had dug it up in all these years. Couldn't help feeling something cold touch his spine when he thought about digging under a hanging tree, disturbing ground where violent men had been buried without prayer or forgiveness. He told himself it was just superstition, just old stories meant to scare away claim jumpers and treasure hunters. The dead were dead, the gold was gold, and tomorrow he'd be rich. Simple as that. Except nothing about that tree felt simple. He'd walked past it earlier, getting the lay of the land, and something about it had made him stop, made him stare. The bark was so dark it looked black in places, like it had absorbed more than just sun and rain. The branches twisted overhead like they were reaching for something or away from something he couldn't tell which. And those rope scars, God, those rope scars looked almost fresh in the failing light. Like men had hung there yesterday instead of 14 years ago. The ground around the base was bare. Not unusual for desert country, but still notable. Nothing grew there except tough alkali grass. No flowers, no bushes, nothing that needed real soil. Just that hard, packed earth, pale and dead-looking, stretching out from the trunk in a rough circle maybe 20 feet across, and it was quiet there, too quiet. Birds didn't land in those branches, insects didn't buzz around the trunk, even the wind seemed to avoid it, blowing around it instead of through it. Abel had stood there for 5 minutes, and in that whole time he hadn't heard a single sound except his own breathing. That should have warned him, should have made him pack up his mule and ride away and forget about the gold. But $40,000 is a powerful motivator, and desperation makes a man stupid, or brave. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. He finally fell asleep sometime after midnight, still clutching the map fragment, still thinking about gold. And he dreamed dreams he wouldn't remember clear come morning, but that left him sweating and gasping. Dreams about men hanging and dirt closing over faces and hands reaching up from under the ground. He woke before dawn, the stars still bright overhead, and he knew he was going to do it, knew he was going to dig. All the warnings and all the superstitions and all the bad feelings couldn't outweigh that simple arithmetic, $40,000 versus everything else. He loaded his tools into a sack, grabbed his lantern, and walked out to the tree. The sky was just starting to lighten in the east, that pale gray that comes before true dawn. The town was silent behind him. The desert was silent around him, and the tree stood dark against the fading stars, waiting. Abel walked around to the north side, counting his paces from the trunk like the map instructed, 6 feet. Right about here. He set down his lantern, pulled out his shovel, and looked at the ground. This was it. This was the moment. Start digging and commit to it, or walk away and live with wondering for whatever time he had left. He thought about the old Mexican's warning, thought about Mason Cord's last words, thought about 14 years of that gold sitting untouched under cursed ground. Then he thought about dying broke in some flop house, alone and forgotten, with nothing to show for 40 years of chasing dreams in the desert,
He pushed the shovel into the ground. The dirt was hard, but not impossible. He worked steady, throwing shovelfuls to the side, feeling the familiar burn in his shoulders and back. The sky kept lightening. Birds started singing somewhere off in the distance, but none came close to the tree. The breeze picked up as the sun touched the horizon, but it blew around him, not through him, and then he heard it. Faint at first, so faint he thought he was imagining it. The creak of rope, the slow swing of something heavy. He looked up at the branches above him, but they were still. No wind strong enough to move them, no rope hanging from them, nothing but empty air and that creaking sound, soft and steady, like a porch swing moving in the night. Abel told himself it was just the tree settling, just wood expanding in the morning heat. He kept digging. The hole grew deeper. 3 feet, 4 feet, 5 feet. The creaking got louder. Definitely rope now. Unmistakable. The sound of hemp under tension, the sound of a hanged man swinging slow. But there was no rope, no man. Just that sound, coming from nowhere and everywhere, growing louder with every shovelful of dirt. At 6 feet deep, his shovel hit something solid, not rock too regular for rock. He knelt in the hole, brushing dirt away with his hands, and there it was. Canvas wrapping, rotted and stained, but still intact enough to see what it contained. The shape of boxes underneath, heavy boxes, the kind that hold gold coin. Abel's hands shook as he worked to uncover it. This was real. The gold was real. $40,000, right here under his fingers. He'd found it. After 40 years of failures and false hopes and broken dreams, he'd finally found the big score. He pulled the first box free of the dirt. It was heavy as sin and twice as dark, the metal blackened with age, the lock rusted solid. He set it on the edge of the hole and reached for the second box. This one came up easier. He was laughing now, couldn't help himself, giddy with success and greed and relief. That's when his lantern went out. Just died, though it had been burning steady all morning. The flame guttered and disappeared, leaving him in the pale pre-dawn light, standing in a hole 6 feet deep under the gallows tree, holding a box of stolen gold. And in that sudden darkness, Abel heard voices, whispering, low and urgent and too close. He couldn't make out words, but the tone was clear enough, angry, accusing, the sound of men who'd died violent and didn't rest easy. He scrambled out of that hole faster than a man his age should be able to move. His bad leg screamed at him, but fear overrides pain every time. He grabbed the 2 boxes, heavy as they were, and he ran limping and gasping back toward town, back toward light and people and anything that wasn't that tree and that hole and those voices in the dark. He made it 20 feet before he fell, his bad leg finally giving out. He hit the ground hard, the boxes flying from his hands, scattering gold coins across the pale dirt. And as he lay there, gasping and hurting, he looked back at the tree. The rope was swinging. There was no rope there, he could see that clear as day. But the motion was unmistakable, that slow pendulum swing of something heavy hanging from the branch. And underneath it, in the shadows where the morning light hadn't reached yet, he could swear he saw shapes, 3 of them, standing, watching, waiting. Abel didn't try to gather the coins, didn't go back for the boxes still in the hole. He crawled the rest of the way to town, pulling himself along on his elbows, leaving a trail through the dust, not looking back, because looking back seemed like the worst idea in the world. He made it to the old church, the one building in town that still had a door that locked, and he barricaded himself inside. And for the rest of that day, he sat with his back against the wall, shaking, listening to his own harsh breathing, trying not to think about what he'd seen or hadn't seen or almost saw under the gallows tree. The gold was real. He'd touched it, held it in his hands. $40,000, just sitting there waiting to be taken. But he couldn't go back for it. Something about that tree, something about those voices, something about the way the rope swung when there was no rope, it had broken something in him. Broken the greed or the courage or whatever it was that had made him think disturbing that ground was a good idea. As the sun climbed and the day grew hot, Abel finally found the strength to move. He gathered his few belongings, loaded them onto his tired mule, and he left Sable Creek, left the gold where it lay, scattered in the dirt and buried in that hole, left it for the tree and the dead men and whatever else guarded it in the darkness. He rode east, back toward Deming, back toward anywhere else, and he never told anyone what he'd found, never showed anyone the map, never went back to that town or that tree or that cursed ground where gold slept and dead men whispered, "Some fortunes aren't worth the finding. Some prices are too high to pay." Abel learned that lesson in a hole 6 feet deep under a hanging tree, learned it so hard and so clear that it changed him. He stopped prospecting after that. Took a job as a stable hand in Deming, lived simple, died quiet 5 years later without ever speaking of the gallows tree or the gold he'd left there. But the gold stayed, and the tree stood, and the story grew, because nothing stays secret in the desert, and nothing stays buried forever. The tale of the old prospector who'd dug and run, who'd found the treasure and fled from it, who'd broken his leg and his nerve under the gallows tree that became part of the legend. Another layer of warning, another reason not to dig. But warnings don't work on desperate men. They never have. Eso, and the next fool was already out there somewhere, hearing the story, seeing the possibility, thinking he'd be different, thinking he'd be the one to take that gold and walk away rich. The tree could wait. It had all the time in the world. And the gold wasn't going anywhere. It was patient as death, dark as a hanging, and twice as permanent, waiting in the ground beneath the gallows tree, guarded by men who died protecting it, cursed by last words and violent ends, waiting for the next man brave enough or foolish enough to dig. Would you like me to continue with the remaining sections? I'll maintain the same voice, pacing, and atmosphere through the climax, aftermath, and closing reflection. Yes, time moves strange around cursed places. Days feel longer, nights feel heavier, and the space between heartbeats seems to stretch out until you can feel every second ticking past like drops of water on stone. That's how it was in Sable Creek after Abel ran. The town, what was left of it, felt different, heavier somehow, like the air itself had weight. The few folks still living there, they noticed the scattered coins. Hard not to notice gold glinting in the dirt when you're walking past the tree. Old Mrs. Hendricks found 3 of them, picked them up with shaking hands, took them home and hid them in a coffee can under her bed. She died in her sleep 2 nights later. Natural causes, the doctor said. She was 84 and her heart just gave out. But her daughter swore the coins were gone when they cleaned out the house, vanished like they'd never been there at all. A drifter passing through found 2 more coins, spent them in the next town over for whiskey and a hot meal. He made it 20 miles before his horse stepped in a prairie dog hole and threw him, broke his neck clean. The sheriff who found him said the dead man's pockets were empty, no coins, no money, nothing. Just a body with a broken neck and a look on his face like he'd seen something terrible in that last moment. The rest of the coins disappeared on their own. Maybe the wind covered them with dust. Maybe animals kicked dirt over. Maybe they sank back into the ground they came from, called home by whatever slept beneath the gallows tree. However it happened, within a week the ground looked like it always had, bare and hard-packed, with no sign that Abel had ever dug there. No sign that gold had ever touched the surface. But the boxes were still down in that hole, 2 strong boxes full of gold coin, sitting 6 feet deep in cursed ground, covered by a thin layer of dirt that Abel had kicked back when he ran. Not buried proper, not hidden careful, just sitting there waiting. Waiting for the next fool, waiting for the greed to outweigh the fear. Waiting with the patience that only inanimate things can have, the patience of stone and metal and earth that's seen civilizations rise and fall and knows it'll be here long after the last human voice goes silent. That next fool came in the autumn of 1897. His name was Thomas Beckwith, but everyone called him Beck. He was 28 years old, which made him young enough to be brave and stupid in equal measure, old enough to have some experience with hard living, and exactly the right age to think he was smarter than everyone who'd come before him. Beck had been a gambler down in El Paso, and a pretty good one until he got caught cheating at cards. The men he'd cheated gave him a choice, leave town or leave life. He chose town, rode north with what money he could grab, and ended up in Deming looking for his next opportunity. That's where he heard about Abel. Not directly from Abel, the old prospector was dead by then, gone to whatever reward or punishment awaited men who disturbed the graves of hanged outlaws. But he'd talked before he died, talked in his sleep, muttering about trees and voices and gold scattered in the dirt. The woman who ran the boarding house where he'd died, she'd heard him, and she talked to her sister, who talked to her husband, who mentioned it one night in a saloon where Beck happened to be drinking. Beck was a practical man, didn't believe in curses or ghosts or anything he couldn't see, touch, or spend. To him, the story of the Gallows tree was simple. Economics, high risk, high reward. Sure, some old man had gotten spooked and run away, but old men spook easy. Young men with steady nerves and good sense, they could handle a little atmosphere. They could dig up some gold and walk away rich, curse be damned. He spent 2 weeks planning, asked around casual-like about Sable Creek, about the tree, about the layout of the land, bought himself a good strong shovel, a reliable lantern, a pistol in case he ran into trouble of the human kind. He packed supplies for a week, though he figured he'd only need one night to dig, load up the gold, and ride away before anyone noticed he'd been there. Beck left Deming on a Thursday morning, timed it so he'd reach Sable Creek after dark. He didn't want witnesses, didn't want anyone knowing where he'd gone or what he was after. Far as anyone knew, he was heading to Arizona to try his luck in the copper camps. Respectable, legitimate, nothing to do with cursed gold or hanging trees or dead outlaws. He reached the ruins of Sable Creek just after sunset, the sky gone purple and orange in that particular way it does in desert country, like the whole world's bruised and bleeding. The town was even more dead than when Abel had visited, down to maybe a dozen people now, most of them too old or too poor or too stubborn to leave. Nobody paid Beck any attention as he rode through. Nobody cared about one more drifter passing through a dying town. He made camp in the same livery stable Abel had used, though he didn't know that. Just seemed like the most intact building, the best shelter. He waited there as the sun went down and the stars came out, cold and distant and uncaring. He checked his equipment twice, made sure his lantern was full of oil, made sure his shovel was sharp and strong. He ate some jerky and hardtack, drank water from his canteen, tried to settle his nerves. Because despite all his talk about not believing in curses, despite his practical nature and his steady hands, Beck felt something when he looked out at that tree. Felt it in his gut, that instinctive animal warning that says danger, that says wrong, that says turn around and go home while you still can. The tree was visible from the stable, silhouetted against the stars, its twisted branches reaching up like claws. Even from a distance, even in darkness, it had presence, had weight. Drew the eye and held it, made you look even when looking made your skin crawl. Beck told himself he was just psyching himself out, letting old stories and superstition get into his head. The tree was just a tree. The gold was just gold. Dead men stayed dead, and the only things that came back to haunt you were bad debts and angry fathers. He was going to dig up that fortune and ride away rich, and in 10 years he'd be laughing about the night he got spooked by a cottonwood tree. He waited until midnight, not for any mystical reason, just practical. Midnight meant the town was asleep, meant anyone with sense was in bed, meant he'd have privacy to do what needed doing. The moon was up, near about 3/4 full, giving enough light to see by without needing the lantern yet. Beck gathered his tools and walked out to the tree. The night was cold, that desert cold that comes when the sun goes down and takes all the warmth with it. His breath misted in front of his face, his boots crunched on the hard ground, and somewhere far off, a coyote called that long, lonely howl that sounds like grief and hunger mixed together. The tree loomed larger as he got closer. Funny how that works, you know exactly how tall something is, but at night, in the dark, it seems bigger, more imposing. The branches spread overhead like a canopy of twisted wood, blocking out patches of stars. The trunk was massive, had to be 6 feet across, with that bark so dark it looked like it had been painted with tar. And those rope scars, God. In the moonlight they looked fresh, looked raw, looked like they'd been carved there yesterday instead of decades ago. Deep grooves in the wood where hemp had rubbed and cut, where weight had hung and struggled, where men had died slow. Beck stood at the base of the tree and looked up into those branches. Tried to imagine what it had been like standing here with a rope around your neck, feeling the scratch of hemp on your skin, knowing that in a few seconds you'd be dancing in the air, choking, dying, while a crowd watched and some cheered. Tried to imagine Mason Cord standing here, looking down at the ground where his gold was buried, knowing he'd never spend a dime of it. Then he shook off the thoughts and got to work. He was here to dig, not to philosophize. The gold was buried on the north side, 6 feet from the trunk, 6 feet deep. Abel had found it, which meant the boxes were still there. Just had to dig them up, load them on his horse, and ride away. Simple. He positioned himself where he figured the hole should be, where the ground looked slightly disturbed, where Abel must have dug. He pushed the shovel into the earth and started working. The dirt was hard, harder than he expected, like it had been packed down deliberately. He had to put his weight behind each thrust, had to work for every shovelful. The work warmed him up fast. Within 10 minutes he'd shed his coat. Within 20 he was sweating despite the cold. The hole grew slowly, 1 foot deep, then 2, then 3. His shoulders burned, his hands blistered. He'd done physical labor before, but there was something about this digging that felt harder than it should, like the ground was fighting him, like the earth didn't want to give up what it held. At 4 feet deep, he heard the first sound, a creak, slow and long, like wood under stress, like a branch bending under weight. He looked up at the tree, at the branches overhead, but they were still. No wind to move them, no reason for that sound. He told himself it was just the tree settling, just wood expanding or contracting with the temperature change. Trees made sounds. That was normal, natural, nothing to worry about. He kept digging. At 5 feet deep, the sound came again, louder this time. Definitely a creak, definitely rope under tension, and something else underneath it, a sound like breathing, slow, raspy breathing, like someone with a crushed windpipe trying to draw air. Beck stopped digging, stood in his hole with the shovel in his hands, listening. The sound continued for maybe 10 seconds, then faded. Silence settled back over the field, broken only by his own harsh breathing and the distant coyotes. Just nerves, he said out loud, his voice sounding too loud in the quiet. Just getting in your own head. Keep digging. He dug. The hole reached 6 feet, and his shovel hit something solid. His heart leaped. This was it. This was the gold. He knelt in the hole, the walls of earth pressing in on both sides, and started clearing dirt with his hands. Canvas, rotted and stained but still recognizable, and underneath the hard edge of metal, a box, a strong box. He'd found it. He'd actually found it. Beck wanted to laugh, wanted to shout, wanted to do something to celebrate, but he kept quiet, kept working, pulling dirt away from the box, exposing more of it. That's when he saw the other thing, partially uncovered by his digging, pressed up against the strong box like it had been buried at the same time. A skull, human skull, browned with age, the jaw hanging open in a silent scream, empty eye socket staring up at him from the bottom of the hole. Mason Cord, maybe, or Briggs, or Cutter. One of the outlaws buried here, their bones mixed with the gold they'd died protecting. The sight should have bothered him, should have made him stop, made him think, made him reconsider what he was doing. But Beck was too far, gone with greed to care. Just a skull, just bones. The dead were dead, and the gold was real. He worked the first box loose, heavy as hell, his muscles screaming. He set it on the edge of the hole and reached for the second one. This one was deeper, wedged under the first, and he had to dig more to free it. His hands touched more bones, a rib cage maybe, or an arm. Hard to tell, and he didn't care enough to figure it out. The second box came free. He lifted it up, grunting with effort, and set it next to the first. 2 strong boxes, $40,000 in gold, all his. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. All those warnings, all those stories about curses and haunted ground, all of it was just superstition. Just old tales meant to scare away people who weren't smart enough or brave enough till the rope above him started to swing. Beck looked up, his hand still on the second strong box, and he saw it clear as day. No rope actually hanging there. The branch was bare, empty, but the motion was unmistakable, that slow pendulum swing, back and forth, and the sound, God, the sound, the creak of hemp under weight, the rasp of breathing, and underneath it all, a voice, low and rough and barely audible, but definitely a voice. Should have stayed buried, it said. Or maybe it was just the wind. Maybe it was just his imagination. Maybe it was. The lantern went out, just died, flame snuffed like a giant hand had covered it. And in the sudden darkness Beck heard more voices, 3 of them now, distinct and clear, speaking in unison. "Told you," they said. "Told you not to dig. Told you the gold carries weight. Told you." Beck scrambled out of that hole like the devil himself was chasing him. His bad leg caught on the edge, and he fell hard on the ground next to the strong boxes. He lay there gasping, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst, and he looked back at the tree. 3 shapes, hanging from that empty branch, swaying slow in non-existent wind. Dark shapes, man-shaped, rope around their necks, feet dangling 6 feet off the ground. He could see them clear in the moonlight, see their features, see their clothes, see the rope burns on their necks. Mason Cord in the middle, Ezra Cutter to the left, Briggs to the right. All 3 of them dead 14 years, but hanging there fresh as the day they'd died, watching him with eyes that should have been gone to rot but weren't, mouths open in screams that had no sound. Beck tried to move, tried to run, but his body wouldn't obey. He just lay there in the dirt next to the stolen gold, watching the hanged men swing, listening to the creak of rope that wasn't there. The shapes grew more solid, more real, until he could see every detail, the blood on Mason's shirt from where they'd shot him, the bruises on Cutter's face from where they'd beaten him down, the twisted angle of Briggs' neck from where he'd hung himself in his cell. Then they spoke. Not with voices that came from throats they couldn't, not with ropes around their necks, but he heard them anyway, heard them inside his head, their words burning like brands. "You wanted our gold," Mason said. "Come take it. Come join us. There's room on this branch for 1 more. There's always room for 1 more. We'll share," Cutter said, his voice like gravel scraping on stone. "Share the gold, share the ground, share the rope. Fair's fair. Take it," Briggs said, and his voice was the worst of all, soft and educated and completely mad. "Take it and see how long you keep it. See how far you get. See what the gold costs when you try to spend it." Beck found his voice then, found the ability to scream. He screamed, and somehow that broke the paralysis. He scrambled to his feet, his bad leg screaming protest, and he ran. Didn't take the gold, didn't take his tools, didn't take anything but his own terror. Just ran limping and gasping back toward town, back toward light and people. And anything that wasn't that tree and those shapes and those voices. Behind him he heard laughter, dead men's laughter, dry as old bones, empty as abandoned graves. And underneath it, that creak of rope, that slow swing of weight, that sound of something hanging in the darkness. He made it to the stable, barricaded himself inside with his horse, and spent the rest of the night pressed into a corner with his pistol in his hand, shaking so hard his teeth chattered. Every sound made him jump. Every shadow looked like a hanging man. Every creak was rope under tension. When dawn came, pale and cold, Beck looked out at the tree. The shapes were gone. The rope, real or imagined, hung still. Everything looked normal, looked natural, looked like it had been nothing but tricks of moonlight and an overactive imagination. But the strong boxes were still there. Still sitting at the edge of that hole, dark metal glinting in the early light, still full of gold, still waiting, Beck stared at them for a long time. Stared at that fortune, at 40,000 reasons to go back, at the wealth that could change his life. And he thought about it. Actually considered going back in daylight, when the ghosts, if they were ghosts, would be gone. Considered loading that gold onto his horse and riding away and never looking back. Then he remembered the voices, remembered the shapes hanging from empty branches, remembered the way the dead men had looked at him with eyes that should have been gone but weren't. And he knew with absolute certainty that if he took that gold, if he tried to keep it, those shapes would follow, would hang in his dreams, would swing from every tree he passed, would haunt him until the day he died, and maybe even after. Some prices are too high to pay. Some fortunes cost more than they're worth. Beck learned that lesson in a hole 6 feet deep, learned it so hard that it broke something in him, broke the greed or the courage or the part of his brain that could still believe in the rational world. He loaded his horse, gathered what few supplies he had, and he rode out of Sable Creek without looking back. Left the strong boxes sitting there in the morning sun, left them for the next fool, left them for the tree and the dead men and whatever force guarded that cursed ground. He made it to Arizona, took a job as a freight clerk, lived quiet and nervous for 3 more years. Then one night he stepped out of a saloon and walked straight in front of a freight wagon, killed instantly. The driver swore Beck had looked right at him, had seen the wagon coming, but had walked into its path anyway, like he wanted to be hit, like he was tired of looking over his shoulder. They found a gold coin in his pocket, single coin, blackened with age, with a face stamped on it that the local sheriff swore looked just like Beck himself. They buried it with him, and the grave digger said the next morning that coin was gone, vanished from the coffin like it had never been there at all. Back at Sable Creek, the strong boxes sat in the sun for 3 days. Then a windstorm came through, one of those desert gales that picks up everything not nailed down and moves it half a mile. When the dust settled, the boxes were gone from the edge of the hole, and the hole itself was filled in, the dirt smooth and hard packed like it had never been disturbed. Some folks said the wind did it. Some said the dead men reclaimed their gold. Some said the earth itself had swallowed it back down, tired of men digging where they shouldn't dig. But everyone agreed on this. The gold was still there, still buried under the gallows tree, still waiting, still guarded by 3 outlaws who died protecting it and who weren't about to let some fool walk away with it now. The tree stood unchanged. The rope scars looked fresh as ever, and at night, if you listened close, you could hear it, that slow creak of hemp under weight, that swing of something heavy, that whisper of dead men guarding their treasure, waiting for the next fool brave enough or stupid enough to dig. Stories have a way of growing in the dark spaces between one telling and the next. What starts as simple fact gets decorated with speculation, gets embroidered with possibility, until the truth, whatever truth there was to begin with, disappears under layers of legend like a rock buried in river silt. You can still feel the shape of it underneath, but the details get smoothed away, get changed, get improved upon until the story becomes bigger than the thing it's describing. That's what happened with the gallows tree gold. Every fool who tried to dig it up and failed, every man who got spooked and ran, every strange death or disappearance that happened anywhere near Sable Creek, all of it got added to the legend. The tree became more than just a tree. The gold became more than just stolen money, and the 3 dead outlaws became more than just men who'd been hanged for their crimes. They became guardians, vengeful spirits, demons wearing human shape. The stories varied depending on who was telling them, but they all agreed on the essentials. The gold was cursed, the dead men protected it, and anyone who tried to take it would pay a price higher than the fortune was worth. But here's the thing about curses and legends and warnings: they only work on people who believe in them. And there's always someone who doesn't believe, who thinks they're smarter or stronger or luckier than everyone who came before. There's always someone who hears the warnings and thinks, but not me. That someone, in the spring of 1899, was a fellow named Carter Hayes. Carter was 35 years old, educated at a fancy school back east, came from money but had pissed away his inheritance on bad investments and worse women. He'd come west not to make his fortune but to escape his creditors. Figured the frontier was a good place to disappear until the heat died down. He'd been drifting for 2 years, doing odd jobs, gambling when he had the stake, stealing when he didn't. He heard about the Gallows tree gold in a whorehouse in Tucson. One of the girls mentioned it while they were lying in bed, said her brother had tried to dig it up and had come back changed, scared, wouldn't talk about what he'd seen. Carter had laughed at that, said there was no such thing as curses, no such thing as ghosts, no such thing as dead men protecting buried treasure. It's just gold, he'd said, lighting a cigarette and blowing smoke at the ceiling. Metal doesn't have memory. Dead men don't have agency. It's all just superstition and mass hysteria. Someone's going to dig up that fortune someday, and they're going to laugh at all the fools who were too scared to try. The girl had looked at him with something like pity. Maybe you should be the one, then, if you're so sure it's just gold. And Carter, never one to back down from a challenge, especially not one issued by a pretty girl in a rented bed, he had said, "Maybe I will." But Carter was smarter than Abel or Beck. He didn't just ride out to Sable Creek with a shovel and hope for the best. He spent weeks researching, gathering information, planning his approach. He went to libraries and newspaper offices, reading every account of the original robbery and hanging he could find. He tracked down people who'd known the outlaws, who'd seen the execution, who'd heard Mason Cord's last words, and he developed a theory, a rational, scientific theory about what was really happening at the Gallows tree. The curse, Carter decided, was psychological, mass hysteria combined with guilt and suggestion. The people who tried to dig up the gold were predisposed to believe in curses, and that belief created the experience. They saw what they expected to see, heard what they feared to hear, and their own minds manufactured the ghosts and voices that drove them away. But a rational man, a man who didn't believe in the supernatural, who approached the situation with scientific detachment, such a man could break the curse, could dig up the gold and walk away rich, because his mind wouldn't create the hallucinations that had defeated everyone else. Carter was proud of this theory, thought it showed real insight, real intelligence. He even wrote it down in a journal he kept, laying out his reasoning step by step, documenting his preparations, planning to publish it someday as proof that reason could triumph over superstition. He arrived in Sable Creek on a Tuesday evening in late May, when the days were long and hot, and the nights still held a chill. The town was down to maybe 8 people now, all of them old, all of them waiting to die in the place they'd spent their lives. Nobody questioned Carter when he rode in. Nobody cared. Just another drifter passing through a dead town. Nothing special about him. Carter made camp in the church, this time the old Baptist church at the edge of town, still standing, though the roof was starting to go, and the pews were warped from years of weather coming through the broken windows. He liked the symbolism of it, liked the idea of using a house of God to plan his assault on cursed ground. Seemed fitting somehow. He spent the first 2 days observing the tree from a distance, taking notes, sketching the layout, measuring with surveyor's tools he'd bought in Tucson. He approached it like a scientific problem, because that's what it was, just a problem waiting for the right solution. The tree was impressive, he had to admit that. Even in broad daylight, even with his rational mind fully engaged, there was something about it that drew the eye and held it. The size, maybe it really was massive, easily the biggest tree for miles, or the shape those twisted branches did look almost deliberate, almost purposeful, like they'd grown that way by choice rather than by accident. And those rope scars, Carter examined them close, running his hands over the grooves worn into the bark. They were deep, deeper than he'd expected. How many men had hung from this tree? More than 3, surely. The marks suggested dozens of hangings over many years. This tree had a history of violence long before Mason Cord and his partners were strung up. but it was still just a tree. Wood and sap and bark and roots. Nothing supernatural about it, nothing mystical, nothing that couldn't be explained by natural processes and human psychology. Carter dug during the day. That was his first innovation. All the others had dug at night, maybe thinking darkness would hide them, maybe because the stories all took place at night and they were unconsciously reinforcing their own fears. But Carter figured daylight would strip away the spooky atmosphere, would make the whole thing mundane and ordinary. He started digging on Thursday morning, right after breakfast, with the sun already hot and bright. He'd brought proper equipment, not just a shovel, but a pickaxe for the hard-packed earth, a sieve to filter through the dirt, even a small tent he could set up over the hole to provide shade while he worked. The digging went easier than he'd expected. Maybe the ground had been disturbed enough times that it was looser than virgin soil. Maybe his technique was better than the panicked scrabbling of the men who'd come before. Whatever the reason, he made good progress, and by noon he was down 4 feet. He took a break then, sitting in the shade of his tent, drinking water and eating the lunch he'd packed. He felt good, felt confident, felt like he was going to prove his theory correct. No voices, no ghosts, no swinging ropes, just dirt and effort, and somewhere down there, $40,000 waiting to be claimed. He was back in the hole by 1 o'clock, working steady, the pick and shovel rhythmic and soothing. 5 feet deep, 5.5, 6 feet. His pick hit something solid. Carter felt a surge of triumph. He'd done it. Found the gold in broad daylight without any supernatural interference. He set aside the pick and used his hands to clear the dirt, eager now, his heart beating faster with anticipation. The first thing he uncovered wasn't a strong box. It was a locket, a woman's locket, silver or maybe steel, blackened with age and tarnish. It was oval-shaped, small enough to fit in a man's palm, with a delicate chain still attached. Carter picked it up, brushed the dirt off, tried to open it. The locket resisted for a moment, then sprung open with a click that seemed too loud in the quiet afternoon. Inside was a photograph, badly faded but still visible. A woman, young, pretty, with dark hair and sad eyes. On the opposite side, tucked under a piece of glass, was a lock of hair, brown or black, hard to tell with the age on it. Carter stared at it for a long moment. This hadn't been mentioned in any of the accounts he'd read. Nobody had said anything about a locket buried with the gold. He turned it over, looking for an inscription, and found one on the back. MC, forever, yours E.L. MC, Mason Cord, and E.L. Some woman, probably the sweetheart he'd left behind when he took to the outlaw life. Carter felt an unexpected pang of something not quite sympathy, but recognition. These weren't just faceless criminals. They'd been people once, people with connections, with loves, with lives that meant something to someone. He set the locket aside and kept digging. Now he found bones. A skull, just like Beck had described, jaw hanging open, eye sockets empty and dark. The rest of the skeleton was there too, jumbled and broken, mixed in with the dirt like it had been buried in pieces or disturbed by previous digging. One of the outlaws, buried without ceremony, left to rot in the ground beneath the tree he'd hung from. And there, pressed up against the skull, was the first strong box. Carter pulled it free, grunting with the weight of it. The metal was cold even in the afternoon heat, cold and dark and somehow greasy to the touch, like it was covered in a film of something he couldn't see. He set it on the edge of the hole and reached for the second box. This one was deeper, wedged under where the first had been. He had to dig more to reach it, his hands moving past more bones, ribs, vertebrae, what might have been a hand still wearing the fragments of a rope around the wrist bones. The sight should have bothered him, should have made him pause, made him think about what he was doing. But Carter was too focused on the prize, too invested in being right, too determined to prove that rational thought could overcome superstition. He got the second box free, lifted it up, set it next to the first. 2 strong boxes, $40,000, his vindication and his fortune, all in one. He'd done what no one else could do, approached the problem rationally, worked methodically, and succeeded where others had failed. He was climbing out of the hole, ready to open the boxes and confirm what was inside, when he heard it. A whisper, faint and indistinct, like someone speaking just below the threshold of hearing. He froze, one foot still in the hole, listening. Nothing, just wind through the branches above, just the natural sounds of the desert afternoon. His imagination, that's all. The suggestion planted by all those stories, trying to manifest even in his rational mind. He ignored it and finished climbing out. The strong boxes sat in the sun, their metal dark as old blood. Carter knelt beside them, examining the locks. They were rusted solid, hadn't been opened in nearly 20 years. He'd brought tools for this, a chisel and hammer, proper implements for breaking locks without damaging what was inside. He positioned the chisel on the first lock and raised the hammer. Before he could strike, the whisper came again, louder this time, clear enough to make out the shape of words even if he couldn't quite hear them, coming from the boxes, coming from inside the boxes. Carter told himself it was just air escaping through gaps in the old metal, just the sound of rust and age and nothing more. He struck the lock. The chisel bit into the old metal with a sound like a scream, and the lock snapped open. He lifted the lid. Gold, row upon row of gold coins, stacked neat and careful, glinting in the sunlight. More money than Carter had ever seen in one place, more wealth than he could have imagined. He reached for one of the coins, his hands trembling with excitement, with greed, with the knowledge that he'd done it, he'd actually done it. The coin burned him, not hot, but cold. So cold it felt like his skin was freezing to the metal. He dropped it with a gasp and looked at his hand. His fingers were red, like frostbite, like he'd grabbed ice instead of gold. And the whispers got louder. Coming from the coins now, definitely coming from the coins. Multiple voices, overlapping, urgent. He still couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear, angry, accusing, warning. The sound made his teeth ache, made his bones feel cold, made something deep in his hindbrain start screaming at him to run. But he was rational, scientific. He wasn't going to be defeated by auditory hallucinations and psychosomatic cold burns. This was just his mind playing tricks on him, just the power of suggestion manifesting physical symptoms. If he ignored it, if he pushed through, it would stop. He reached for another coin, gritting his teeth against the cold. This one burned worse than the first, cold so intense it felt like his hand was being dipped in liquid nitrogen. He held on anyway, forcing himself to pick it up, to prove he could. The whispers became shouts, became screams, became a chorus of voices all crying out together in rage and pain and warning. Carter looked at the coin in his hand, really looked at it. The face stamped on the metal, it wasn't a generic profile like you'd see on normal currency. It was a face he recognized, his own face, his features rendered in metal, staring back at him with empty coin press eyes. He dropped it, staggered back from the boxes. That wasn't possible, wasn't rational, wasn't explainable by any scientific theory. The coins had been buried for 20 years, minted before that. They couldn't show his face. They couldn't. But when he looked at the other coins visible in the strong box, they all showed the same thing. Hundreds of them, all stamped with his face, all staring up at him with that blank metal gaze, like the gold was waiting for him specifically, like it had always been waiting for him. The voices weren't whispering anymore. They were speaking clear as day, 3 distinct voices, all talking at once. "Told you it was cursed," Mason Cord said. "Told you the gold remembers. Told you it knows. Names," Ezra Cutter said, his voice rough and broken. "It's whispering names, all the names of men who've touched it, all the names of men who've died. Your name's on there now," Briggs said, and his voice held laughter. "Stamped on the metal, part of the fortune, part of us." Carter ran. Didn't close the boxes, didn't fill the hole, didn't take anything but his own terror. Just ran back to the church where he'd made camp, his hands still burning with cold, his ears still ringing with voices that shouldn't exist. He stayed there the rest of the day, pacing, shaking, trying to convince himself it had been a hallucination. mass hysteria. The power of suggestion, combined with heat exhaustion and dehydration, rational explanations for irrational experiences. His mind trying to make sense of something his eyes had shown him but his brain couldn't accept, but his hands still burned, still felt frozen even when he held them near fire, even when he wrapped them in blankets, even when he plunged them into hot water. The cold went bone deep, blood deep, soul deep, and when he looked at his palms in the lamplight he could swear he saw faces there, coin-stamped faces, his own face, pressed into his flesh like a brand. As darkness fell and the temperature dropped, Carter heard a new sound, not voices this time, something worse, the creak of rope, slow and steady, rhythmic as a heartbeat, coming from outside, from the direction of the tree, the sound of something swinging in windless air. He barricaded the church door, piled pews against it, nailed boards across the windows, did everything he could to keep out whatever was coming. But you can't bar a door against voices, can't nail shut windows against whispers. The sounds came through anyway, seeping in like smoke, filling the church with the memory of rope and death and violated graves. All night Carter sat with his back to the altar, a pistol in his frozen hands, listening to the creak of rope and the whisper of voices and the sound of something dragging across the ground outside. All night he told himself it wasn't real, wasn't possible, wasn't happening. And all night his rational mind crumbled a little more, worn away by sounds that shouldn't exist and cold that burned like fire and the knowledge that he'd been wrong about everything. When morning came, pale and cold, Carter was a changed man. The confidence was gone. The rational certainty was gone. The belief that science could explain everything was shattered like glass dropped on stone. He'd looked into that strong box and seen his own face stamped on cursed gold, and something in him had broken that would never fully heal. He left everything, his tools, his supplies, his careful notes and scientific theories, left it all in that church and rode out of Sable Creek on a horse that felt the wrongness too, that needed no urging to run, that put miles between them and that tree as fast as its legs could manage. Carter made it to Tucson, went straight to the girl who'd told him about the gold, and he showed her his hands. The cold burn marks had faded, but the shapes remained his own face, pressed into his palms like a maker's mark, like a brand of ownership, like the gold had claimed him even though he hadn't taken it. "I saw them," he said, his voice shaking. "Saw the dead men, heard them talk. They said my name is on the gold now, said I'm part of it, part of them." The girl looked at his hands with something like sadness. "I told you," she said. "Told you not to dig. Told you some things are better left buried." Carter spent the next week in that whorehouse, drinking himself numb, trying to forget what he'd seen. The cold in his hands never fully went away, spread up his arms, into his chest, wrapping around his heart like fingers made of ice. And every night, in his dreams, he was back at the tree, digging, finding coins stamped with his face, hearing the whispers of dead men telling him he was theirs now, would always be theirs, that the gold had marked him and the mark would never fade. On the 8th day they found him hanging in his rented room, used his own belt, tied to a roof beam. The strange thing was, there were no chairs or tables nearby, nothing he could have stood on to reach that beam. It was like he'd been lifted up there, like something had helped him into position and then dropped him, or like he'd been hanged by invisible hands, strung up same as the outlaws he'd tried to rob. They buried Carter in the pauper cemetery with no marker and no ceremony, and when they went through his effects, they found 3 gold coins in his pocket blackened with age, each one stamped with his face, each one cold enough to frost the fingers of anyone who touched them. The coins were buried with him. By morning they were gone, vanished from the sealed grave, called back to the tree and the strong boxes and the ground where they'd been sleeping for 20 years. Back at Sable Creek, the strong boxes sat open in the sun for 3 days. Then a dust storm came through, one of those big ones that turn day to night and strip paint off buildings. When it passed, the boxes were closed again, the hole was filled, and the ground looked like it had never been disturbed. And the tree stood, always would stand, with its rope scars and its twisted branches and its cargo of cursed gold, buried under roots that fed on the bodies of hanged men, waiting, always waiting, patient as death and twice as certain, because there's always another fool, always someone who thinks they're different, who thinks they're smarter, who thinks the rules don't apply to them. The gold whispers their names before they ever arrive, knows them before they start digging, claims them before they ever touch the metal, and the dead men, they just keep swinging in the darkness, guarding their fortune, adding names to the coins, waiting for the next fool to join them under the branches of the gallows tree. Would you like me to continue with the final 4 sections? The climax, aftermath, legends, and closing reflection are ready to write. Yes, time kept moving, same as it always does, indifferent to curses and legends and the fear that kept men away from a tree standing alone in an empty field. The 20th century came, bringing automobiles and electricity and the slow death of the frontier. The old ways faded. The old stories got dismissed as superstition by people who'd never known the desert's particular brand of darkness, who'd never felt the weight of watching eyes from empty branches. Sable Creek died its final death around 1910. The last resident, old Tom Hendricks, who'd been born there and refused to die anywhere else, passed away in his sleep at 93. They buried him in the town cemetery, what was left of it, and then there was nobody, just empty buildings and dust and the slow reclamation of the desert taking back what men had borrowed for a while. But the tree stood. Always the tree stood. Time and weather and neglect might destroy buildings, might erase roads, might reduce a whole town to nothing but scattered foundations, stones, and half-buried bottles. But that tree seemed immune to decay. Its branches didn't die. Its roots didn't rot. It stood as solid and dark and wrong as it had 50 years before, 100 years before, however long it had been standing in that spot. The story persisted too, told in different forms now. Automobile travelers passing through would stop and take photographs of the ruins, and someone would mention the tree, and someone else would know the legend. It appeared in books about Western lore, in collections of ghost stories, in those pulp magazines that specialized in tales of the strange and supernatural. The details varied. Sometimes the gold was $40,000, sometimes $100,000, sometimes it was Confederate gold or Aztec treasure, but the core remained constant. Cursed fortune buried under a hanging tree, guarded by violent dead, waiting to destroy anyone who tried to claim it. Most people dismissed it as folklore. A good story, entertaining to tell around campfires, but not something to take seriously. The few who believed stayed away. And the tree stood alone in its field, year after year, decade after decade, with its secret buried under the roots and its patient hunger never satisfied, until Abel returned. Not the first Abel, old Abel Thatcher, who dug and run in 1895, had been dead for 40 years. This was Abel Thatcher, Jr., his grandson, who'd never known the old man but had inherited his name, and it seemed, his stubborn determination. Young Abel was 28 years old in the spring of 1932, in the worst depths of the Depression, when being broke wasn't unusual, but being completely desperate was getting more common every day. Abel Jr. had grown up hearing stories about his grandfather, about how the old man had been a prospector, about how he'd come close to a big strike once but had gotten spooked and run, about how he'd spent his last years jumpy and nervous, always looking over his shoulder, dying young from what the doctors called a bad heart, but what the family suspected was just broken spirit. What Abel Jr. didn't know, what nobody had told him because nobody knew, was that his grandfather had found the gallows tree gold and fled from it. That secret had died with old Abel, buried in whatever memories he'd taken to his grave. All the grandson knew was that somewhere out in the desert there'd been a fortune his grandfather had almost claimed. The Depression had hit Abel Jr. hard. He'd been a clerk in a bank that failed, had lost his job and his savings in the same week, had watched his wife leave him because he couldn't provide, had ended up riding the rails like thousands of other desperate men, going nowhere, hoping for something, finding nothing. He was tired, broke, and out of options when he found his grandfather's journal and a box of family papers his mother had sent to his last known address. The journal was old, brittle, water-damaged in places, but it was readable. And on the last few pages, written in a shaking hand that suggested fear or illness or both, was an account of the trip to Sable Creek, the gallows tree, the gold buried beneath it, the voices in the dark, the shapes hanging from empty branches. His grandfather had written it all down, maybe as a warning, maybe as an explanation for his later behavior, maybe just to get it out of his head. And at the very end, in letters so heavy they'd almost torn through the paper, he'd written, "The gold is real. I touched it, held it, but the price, God help me, the price. Stay away, let it stay buried. Some fortunes are meant to sleep forever." Abel Jr. read that passage over and over, sitting in a boxcar heading west, his stomach empty and his prospects emptier. His grandfather had found real gold, had touched it, had run from it instead of taking it. But his grandfather had been old, had been superstitious, had believed in things that modern men knew were just stories. Abel Jr. didn't believe in curses, didn't believe in ghosts, didn't believe in anything except hunger and desperation and the knowledge that somewhere under a tree in the Arizona desert there was $40,000 in gold coin that nobody had claimed in 50 years. And if his grandfather had been too scared to take it, well, that just meant more for him. He reached Sable Creek, or what was left of it, in late April. The place was completely abandoned now, not even ruins anymore, so much as suggestions of where buildings had stood. The desert had swallowed most of it, left only hints and traces, archaeology in the making. But the tree was unmistakable, standing exactly where his grandfather's rough map said it would be, dark and massive and somehow wrong in a way Abel couldn't quite define. He made camp in the foundation of what might have been the old church, used fallen timbers to build a fire, cooked the last of his beans, and thought about what he was going to do. His grandfather's journal had said the gold was buried on the north side, 6 feet from the trunk, 6 feet deep. Simple enough. Dig, load up, leave. Use the money to start over, maybe go to California, maybe get his wife back. Maybe just live like a human being instead of a stray dog begging for scraps. But he'd wait until morning. No reason to dig at night. That's when his grandfather had dug, and look how that turned out, scared out of his mind, running without the gold, dying young from fear. Abel Jr. would do it different, would do it smart, would approach it like a job, not like some midnight adventure out of a ghost story. He slept poorly that night, kept hearing sounds, creaks and groans, and what might have been voices if you listened too hard. But that was just the wind and the settling of old wood and his own imagination working overtime. Nothing supernatural, nothing to worry about. Morning came cold and clear. Abel ate the last of his food, no point saving it. He'd either be rich by tonight or he'd be no worse off than he was now. He gathered his tools, a shovel he'd stolen from a railroad camp, a pickaxe with a loose head, a burlap sack for carrying the gold, and walked out to the tree. In the daylight it looked less menacing, still big, still dark, still somehow wrong, but not scary. Just a tree, old tree, probably been here 100 years or more, seen a lot of history. The rope scars were visible, deep grooves worn into the bark, but they were old, historical, nothing to fear from old marks in old wood. Abel positioned himself on the north side, measured 6 feet from the trunk with a piece of rope, and started digging. The ground was hard, always was in desert country, but he was young and strong and motivated. He made good progress, the hole growing steadily deeper, the pile of dirt beside it growing higher. At 3 feet, his shovel hit something that made a metallic clink. His heart jumped. Too shallow to be the strong boxes they were supposed to be at 6 feet. But maybe his grandfather had been wrong about the depth. Maybe years of settling had brought them closer to the surface. He dug more carefully now, clearing dirt with his hands. It was a coin, single gold coin, blackened with age, half buried in the hardpack. Abel picked it up, brushed it off, held it up to the light. The face stamped on it was worn almost smooth, but he could make out just enough detail to see that it wasn't any currency he recognized. Not American, not foreign, just wrong somehow. The proportions off, the features distorted, the eyes too wide and staring. He pocketed the coin and kept digging. Found another one at 4 feet, and another at 5. Scattered coins, like someone had dropped them while filling in the hole, or like they'd worked their way up through the soil over the decades. Each one went into his pocket. Each one felt cold, even in the hot morning sun. At 6 feet, his pickaxe hit wood, not metal wood, a box of some kind, but not the iron strong boxes his grandfather had described. This was rougher, cruder, like a coffin or a packing crate. Abel cleared more dirt, exposing the top of it, looking for a way to open it. That's when he realized what it was, the shape, the size, the way it was positioned, not a treasure chest, a coffin. He'd found one of the graves, one of the outlaws, buried at the base of the tree, and the coins had been in the coffin with him, scattered through the dirt during burial, mixed with the bones and the rot. Abel stared at the wooden lid, his hand still on it, suddenly not wanting to dig anymore, not wanting to see what was underneath. But he'd come this far, had dug 6 feet into cursed ground, had to see it through. He worked his pickaxe under the edge of the lid. The wood was soft with rot, came apart easily. He lifted a section away and looked inside. A skeleton lay there, still mostly articulated, wearing the rotted remains of clothes. The skull was turned to the side, jaw open in a silent scream, and around the neck bones was still visible the mark of groove worn into the vertebrae from where the rope had snapped the neck. Mason cord, probably, or Briggs, or Cutter. One of the 3 outlaws, buried without ceremony, left to rot in the ground beneath the tree they'd hung from, and mixed in with the bones, scattered through the coffin like someone had poured them in as an afterthought, were gold coins, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Abel reached for one, his hand shaking, and picked it up. It was cold, cold as ice, cold as death, and when he looked at the face stamped on it, he saw his grandfather staring back at him. Old Abel Thatcher, rendered in metal, eyes wide with fear, mouth open in a scream that had no sound. Abel Jr. dropped the coin and staggered back, nearly falling out of the hole. That wasn't possible, wasn't real. His grandfather had died in 1900, 32 years ago. These coins had been buried in 1883, before his grandfather had ever seen them. They couldn't show his face, couldn't. But when he looked at the other coins visible in the coffin, each one showed a different face. Different men, all frozen in expressions of terror, all stamped into the metal like brands. The faces of everyone who'd ever tried to dig up this gold, he realized with dawning horror. Everyone who'd touched it, claimed by it, their likenesses preserved in the cursed metal forever. And the newest coins, the ones lying on top, they showed his face. His own features, rendered in gold, staring up at him from the bottom of a grave. No, Abel said, his voice too loud in the quiet morning. No, this isn't real. This is just gold, a voice said behind him. Male voice, rough and amused. Just cursed gold, just fortune that costs more than it's worth. Abel spun around, nearly fell again, caught himself on the edge of the hole. 3 men stood there, between him and the tree. They wore old clothes, 1,882 vintage, he thought distantly, the kind you'd see in photographs. Their faces were pale, their eyes too dark, and around each of their necks was a rope burn, purple and black, the mark of men who died by hanging, Mason cord in the middle, Ezra Cutter to the left, Briggs to the right, the 3 outlaws, dead for 50 years, standing in the morning sunlight like it was the most natural thing in the world. You're not real, Abel said, his voice shaking. You're not real. This is just what? Mason asked, tilting his head at an angle that wasn't quite human. Just your mind playing tricks? Just heat exhaustion? Just bad beans and worse dreams? He smiled, and his teeth were too white, too perfect, too sharp. We're as real as you are, as real as the gold, as real as death. We've been waiting for you, Cutter said, his voice like gravel. Knew you'd come. Knew it when your grandfather dug here in '95. Knew he'd tell someone eventually, and that someone would tell someone else, and eventually one of his blood would come looking. He gestured at the hole. And here you are, right on schedule. The gold remembers, Briggs said, and his voice was the worst, soft and educated and completely insane. Remembers everyone who touches it, claims them, marks them. You're marked now, Abel. You and your grandfather, and everyone who came before. The gold has your face. You're part of the fortune now, part of us. Abel tried to climb out of the hole, but his legs wouldn't obey. He just stood there at the bottom of the grave, 6 feet deep, surrounded by bones and cursed gold, while 3 dead men looked down at him with eyes that reflected no light. We buried it here for a reason, Mason said, squatting at the edge of the hole, looking down at Abel like he was examining an insect. Knew we'd hang, knew the gold would end up buried at the base of our own gallows, so we put a piece of ourselves into it, a piece of our death, a piece of our rage, made it ours forever. And now everyone who tries to take it becomes part of it too, part of the fortune, Cutter echoed, part of the tree, part of us. Forever, Briggs finished, and he was smiling now too, all 3 of them smiling with those 2 white teeth, looking down at Abel in his grave. The sun dimmed. Not clouds, there were no clouds, just the light fading, like something was standing between the sun and the earth, blocking its warmth. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many seconds. Abel's breath misted in front of his face. The coins in the coffin began to glow with a faint phosphorescence, lighting the grave from within. Take it, Mason said. Take the gold. It's yours. We're giving it to you. $40,000. All yours. All you have to do is take it out of the grave and carry it away. Abel wanted to refuse, wanted to climb out of the hole and run like his grandfather had run. But his hands were moving without his consent, reaching for the coins, filling his pockets with them. The metal burned cold, froze his fingers, sent ice spreading up his arms. He tried to stop, tried to pull his hands back, but they kept moving, kept gathering gold, kept filling his pockets until they were heavy with cursed fortune. That's it, Briggs encouraged. Take it all. Take your inheritance. Your grandfather couldn't, but you can. You're stronger than he was, braver, more desperate. Abel's pockets were full. His hands were frozen, the fingers blue with cold. He tried to climb out of the grave, but the weight of the gold pulled him down. He clawed at the sides of the hole, but the dirt crumbled under his hands. The grave was deeper than 6 feet now, deeper than 10, growing deeper with every second, the walls stretching up toward a sky that was almost black now. The sun just a dim memory behind whatever darkness had descended. Help me, Abel gasped. Please, help me out. The 3 dead men looked at each other and laughed. Long, dry laughter, the sound of dead lungs pushing out air that didn't need to be there. The sound of men who'd found something funny in hell and wanted to share the joke. Help you? Mason said. We are helping you. We're giving you what you came for. Gold, fortune. Everything your grandfather ran from. It's all yours now, forever. The grave kept getting deeper. Abel screamed and scrabbled at the walls, his frozen hands leaving bloody trails in the dirt. The coins in his pockets grew heavier, dragging him down, pulling him toward the bottom of a hole that had no bottom, into darkness that had no end. Above him, the 3 outlaws watched with interest, like men watching a rat in a trap. The tree's branches began to move, twisting and writhing, reaching down toward the grave, and from those branches, rope began to grow, not hanging there, growing, extending like vines, like snakes, like living things with purpose and hunger. The rope reached Abel, wrapped around his neck, tightened. Welcome to the fortune, Mason said. Welcome to the tree. Welcome to us. Abel felt himself being lifted, felt the rope tightening, cutting off his air, felt the cold of the cursed gold spreading through his whole body, turning his blood to ice, his bones to stone. He tried to scream, but the rope was too tight. tried to fight, but the cold had taken his strength, tried to pray, but he'd forgotten the words. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was the three outlaws smiling up at him as he rose, was the tree's branches reaching out to receive him, was his own face stamped on every coin in his bulging pockets, frozen forever in an expression of terminal terror. The sun came back. The warmth returned. The day resumed being an ordinary April morning in the Arizona desert, and the tree stood unchanged, its branches still and empty, casting a shadow that was just a shadow. At its base, the grave was gone, filled in smooth and level, like it had never been dug. No sign of Abel Jr., no sign of his tools, no sign that anyone had been there at all. But if you looked close at the bark of the tree, you could see a new scar. Fresh rope burn, the wood still raw, the mark of something heavy having hung there recently. Something that struggled and kicked and died slow. And buried under the roots, mixed with the bones of outlaws and the remains of other fools, $40,000 in cursed gold weighted with the patience of the dead, each coin stamped with a new face, each face frozen in fear, each soul claimed by the fortune and added to the collection, part of the tree and the curse and the endless hunger that would never be satisfied. The gallows tree had fed again, and it would feed again, because there's always another fool. Always someone desperate enough or brave enough or stupid enough to dig where the dead men lie. Always the thing about time is it makes people forget. Not completely, the stories remain, passed down and altered and embellished until they're more legend than history, but the sharp edge of warning gets dulled by decades, gets softened by distance, gets dismissed by people who weren't there and don't believe in things they can't explain. By 1960, Sable Creek was a curiosity, the kind of place mentioned in guidebooks for tourists looking for authentic Western ghost towns. The kind of place you'd stop at for an hour on a road trip, take some photographs, maybe pick up a piece of weathered wood or a rusty nail as a souvenir. The ruins had been further reduced by weather and time and the occasional vandal looking for treasure or just something to destroy. But the tree still stood, dark and solid and unchanged. The tourists would photograph it, naturally. It was photogenic in its wrongness, those twisted branches, that too dark bark, those deep scars that looked almost like they'd been carved deliberately. Some of the photographs came out strange, blurry in ways that couldn't be explained by camera shake or bad focus. Or they'd show shapes in the branches that nobody had seen when the picture was taken, shadows that looked almost human, almost hanging, almost real. Most people didn't notice these anomalies, and the ones who did usually chalked it up to technical problems or tricks of light. A few got bothered by it, got a feeling they couldn't quite name, and they'd leave Sable Creek faster than they'd planned and not come back. But most just took their strange photographs and drove away and never thought about it again. The story of the buried gold persisted in local lore, but it had been reduced to the kind of tale old men told in bars, interesting but not believable, entertaining but not actionable. Young people would hear it and laugh, make jokes about digging it up, dare each other to spend a night under the tree, but nobody actually did it. The tree had a reputation now, spread by some instinct that went deeper than conscious thought. Stay away from the gallows tree, don't dig there, don't camp there, don't even get too close if you can help it, but reputations fade, and desperation is a constant. In the summer of 1975, a ranch hand named Tommy Lee was riding fence line about 5 miles from the ruins of Sable Creek. He was 23 years old, worked hard for low pay, had dreams of saving enough to buy his own place someday. But someday seemed a long way off on a ranch hand's wages, and Tommy was starting to think it would never come. He'd stopped to give his horse water from his canteen when he saw something glinting in the dirt. Just a flash, easy to miss, but the sun hit it just right and caught his eye. He dismounted, walked over, and there it was, a coin. Gold coin, half buried in the alkaline soil, looking like it had been there forever or might have just been dropped yesterday. Hard to tell with desert conditions. Tommy picked it up, brushed off the dirt, held it up to examine it. It was old, that much was clear. The metal was tarnished and dark, the edges worn smooth. The face stamped on it was strange, not any currency he recognized, with features that seemed distorted or wrong somehow, but it was gold, real gold. He bit it to check old habit from TV westerns, and yes, soft enough to mark, genuine. He looked around, wondering if there were more. Spent 20 minutes searching that area, found nothing else. Just that single coin, sitting there in the middle of nowhere like it had been waiting for him specifically. He pocketed it, remounted his horse, and continued his work. But all day he kept touching his pocket, feeling the weight of the coin there, thinking about what it might mean. That night in the bunkhouse, Tommy showed the coin to the other hands. They passed it around, examining it, speculating about where it came from. One of the older cowboys, a fellow named Pete who'd worked the area for 40 years, he took one look at it and his face went pale. "Where'd you find this?" Pete asked, his voice tight. "Out near the old ghost town, just sitting in the dirt." Pete handed the coin back like it was a hot iron. "Put it back. Put it back exactly where you found it and don't touch it again." "Why? It's just a coin. Probably worth something to a collector. It's from the Gallows tree," Pete said, and the other cowboys went quiet. "That's cursed gold, every piece of it. Men have died over it. Men have disappeared. You take that coin and keep it, you'll regret it. Mark my words." Tommy laughed. He didn't mean to be disrespectful, but the whole thing sounded ridiculous. Cursed gold, ghost stories. This was 1,975, not 1,875. People didn't believe in curses anymore. "It's just metal," Tommy said. "Just old gold somebody lost. Finders, keepers." Pete shook his head. "Your funeral, kid, but don't say I didn't warn you." Tommy kept the coin, carried it in his pocket like a lucky charm, rubbed it sometimes when he was thinking, showed it to people in town. Most folks just saw an interesting antique, but a few, the old ones, the ones who remembered the stories, they'd get a look on their faces. A look that said they knew something Tommy didn't, something bad. Strange things started happening after that. Small things at first. Tommy's horse spooked for no reason, nearly threw him. His saddle cinch broke 3 times in 2 weeks, and those cinches were new. He kept having dreams about hanging, about a rope around his neck, about struggling for air that wouldn't come. Woke up gasping, his throat sore like something had actually been choking him. Then the accident started. Nothing major, but more than coincidence. He cut his hand on a fence post that shouldn't have been sharp. Got kicked by a horse that had never kicked anyone. Fell off the barn roof while fixing shingles and broke 2 ribs. Each time, in the moment before the accident, he'd hear that creak of rope, that sound of something swinging in windless air. The other hands started avoiding him, not overtly, but noticeably. They'd work different areas of the ranch. They'd eat at different times. They'd find excuses not to ride with him. Because bad luck is contagious. Everyone knows that. And Tommy had bad luck following him like a shadow. After 2 months of this, after a dozen near misses and 3 actual injuries, Tommy decided Pete might have been right. Decided that maybe, just maybe, keeping that coin was a bad idea. He'd return it, put it back where he found it, exactly like Pete had said. Break whatever connection had formed between him and the cursed gold. He rode out to the spot where he'd found the coin on a Saturday afternoon when he had time off. The day was clear and hot, the kind of Arizona summer day that makes you feel like you're riding through an oven. His horse was nervous, dancing and tossing its head, but Tommy pushed on. Had to do this. Had to put things right. He found the spot, or thought he did. Everything looked the same out here. One stretch of desert much like another. But this felt right, felt familiar. He dismounted, pulled the coin from his pocket, knelt down to bury it in the dirt. That's when he looked up and saw the tree. The Gallows tree, visible in the distance, maybe 3 miles away. He'd thought he was further from Sable Creek, but apparently he'd circled closer without realizing it. The tree was unmistakable, even from this distance, that dark shape, those twisted branches, that sense of wrongness that carried even across miles. And Tommy realized something that made his blood go cold. The coin hadn't been randomly lost out here. It had been placed, put here deliberately, far enough from the tree that someone would find it without being warned off by proximity to the ruins. It was bait, a lure, a hook with gold instead of steel, waiting for the right fish to bite. He'd bitten, and now the hook was set. Tommy tried to drop the coin, tried to bury it like he'd planned, but his hand wouldn't open. The coin was stuck to his palm, or his palm was stuck to the coin, he couldn't tell which. The metal was cold now, cold as death, and spreading. The cold went up his arm, into his shoulder, wrapping around his chest like fingers made of ice. His horse bolted, ran flat out back toward the ranch, leaving Tommy alone in the desert with a cursed coin frozen to his hand and the gallows tree visible in the distance, waiting. Tommy started walking toward the tree. He didn't want to, wanted to run in the opposite direction, wanted to scream for help, wanted to do anything except walk toward that dark shape on the horizon. But his legs moved without his consent, carrying him steady and inevitable toward the ruins of Sable Creek, toward the tree, toward whatever waited there in the shadow of twisted branches. It took him 2 hours to walk those 3 miles. 2 hours of fighting every step, of trying to turn around, of screaming until his voice gave out. But his body kept moving, and the cold kept spreading, and the coin stayed frozen to his palm like it had become part of his flesh. He reached the tree just as the sun was setting, the sky gone red and purple, the shadows growing long and dark. Up close, the tree was worse than from a distance. The bark wasn't just dark, it was black, like it had been burned or stained. The branches didn't just twist, they writhed, slow and serpentine, like they were alive and aware. And those rope scars, God, those scars looked fresh, looked like they'd been worn into the wood yesterday. The flesh of the tree still raw and weeping sap that looked too much like blood. At the base of the tree, the ground was soft, not hard packed like desert soil should be. Soft and yielding, like freshly turned earth, like a grave that hadn't fully settled. Tommy stood there looking down at it, at his own reflection in the coin still frozen to his palm, and he understood what was going to happen. The ground opened, not with a sound, not with any visible mechanism, just opened like a mouth, a dark hole appearing at the base of the tree, 6 feet deep, 6 feet wide, waiting. Tommy fell, or jumped, or was pulled. He couldn't tell which. But he was falling, the sides of the hole rushing past him, the darkness swallowing him, and the last thing he saw was the tree's branches reaching down, was rope growing from the wood like vines, was 3 faces looking down at him from the edge of the hole, pale faces, dead faces, faces with rope burns around the neck and smiles that had nothing human in them. He hit the bottom hard, not ground, something softer, something that moved and shifted beneath him. He tried to stand, but his hands sank into whatever he'd landed on, and when he pulled them free, they were covered in gold. Coins, thousands of them, maybe hundreds of thousands. All the gold that had ever been buried here, all the cursed fortune of the gallows tree, piled deep in this hole under the roots. And scattered among the coins were bones, skulls and ribs and scattered vertebrae, the remains of everyone who'd ever tried to claim this gold. Dozens of skeletons, maybe more, all mixed together with the fortune they'd died trying to steal. Mason Cord and his partners, and Abel Thatcher, and Beck, and Carter Hayes, and Abel Jr., and who knew how many others. All of them here, all of them part of the horde now, their bones just more treasure for the tree to guard. Tommy tried to climb out, but the sides of the hole were too steep, too smooth. He tried to dig handholds, but the earth crumbled under his fingers. He tried to scream, but the cold had reached his lungs now and his breath came out as frost. Above him, silhouetted against the darkening sky, the 3 outlaws looked down. They weren't smiling anymore, just watching with empty eyes, with the patience of the dead, with the certainty that Tommy wasn't going anywhere. "Welcome to the fortune," Mason Cord said, his voice drifting down into the hole. "Welcome to the tree. Welcome home." The rope came then, growing down from the branches, snaking down into the hole, wrapping around Tommy's neck. He tried to fight it, but the cold had taken his strength. Tried to pull it off, but his hands were still holding that cursed coin, still frozen to the metal, unable to let go. The rope tightened. Tommy felt himself being lifted, felt his feet leaving the pile of gold and bones, felt the noose doing what nooses do. He kicked and struggled, but there was no air, no hope, no escape. Just the slow death by hanging, the same death that had claimed the outlaws, the same death that had claimed everyone who'd touched this cursed gold. When the ranch hands found Tommy's horse the next morning, it was lathered and wild-eyed and wouldn't let anyone near it for hours. When they finally calmed it down and checked the saddle, they found 3 gold coins in the saddlebag. Blackened coins with strange faces stamped on them, faces that looked disturbingly like Tommy Lee. Nobody wanted to touch those coins. They left them in the bunkhouse, figured they'd deal with them later, but the next morning the coins were gone, vanished like they'd never been there. And Tommy was never seen again. The sheriff searched for weeks, found no body, no sign of struggle, no indication of what had happened, just a missing ranch hand and a story that nobody quite believed. But old Pete knew. Pete had seen it before, would see it again. The tree claimed another one, added another fool to its collection, another set of bones to its hoard, another face to its cursed coins. And somewhere under that tree, buried deep in gold and death, Tommy Lee's remains joined the others who'd thought they could take what wasn't meant to be taken. The tree stood, the gold waited, and time moved on, indifferent and patient, knowing that there would always be another fool, always someone desperate enough or greedy enough or unlucky enough to find a coin that should have stayed buried, always someone who thought the warnings didn't apply to them. Always, here's the thing about cursed places. They don't get better with age. They get worse, like a wound that won't heal, that festers and spreads, that turns septic and poisons everything around it. The gallows tree wasn't getting less dangerous as the decades passed. It was getting more hungry, more active, more determined to feed. By the 1,990 Sable Creek had become something of a dark tourism destination. People seeking thrills, seeking authenticity, seeking that little shiver of fear that comes from standing in a genuinely haunted place. They came with cameras and camping gear, with Ouija boards and EMF detectors, with all the tools of amateur ghost hunters and the confidence of people who didn't really believe but wanted to be scared anyway. Most of them left disappointed, took their photographs, explored the ruins, found nothing but old wood and older stone. Went home with stories about how they'd visited the haunted ghost town and it wasn't scary at all, just sad and empty. Posted their pictures online with captions about how legends are always bigger than reality. But some of them didn't leave disappointed. Some of them saw things, heard things, felt things that made them pack up in the middle of the night and drive away with their headlights burning bright and their accelerators pressed to the floor. They didn't post those pictures online, didn't talk about what they'd seen, just went home and tried to forget, tried to convince themselves it had been imagination or prank or anything except what they knew it had been. The tree appeared in those photographs more and more. Not always, the anomaly wasn't consistent, but maybe one photo in 10, one photo in 20 would show something wrong. Shapes in the branches that hadn't been there when the picture was taken, faces in the bark that looked almost human, shadows that stretched too far, too dark, reaching out toward the photographer like hands. And the coins kept appearing, not in the same place. The tree was smart about it now, had learned from Tommy Lee's fate. The coins showed up at random, one in a parking lot in Tucson, one in a convenience store in Phoenix, one on the side of Highway 80, glinting in the sun, waiting for someone to pull over and pick it up. Most people who found the coins spent them or lost them or threw them away when they noticed how cold the metal felt, how wrong the face stamped on it looked. But a few kept them, and of those few, some made the connection to Sable Creek, to the gallows tree, to the legend of the buried gold. And of those few, a smaller number decided to go looking. Most of them made it back, came to Sable Creek, looked at the tree, felt the wrongness radiating off it like heat off asphalt, and decided that maybe discretion was the better part of valor. They left their coins under the tree like offerings and drove away and counted themselves lucky. The coins would be gone by morning, absorbed back into the hoard, waiting to be placed somewhere else for the next fool to find. But some didn't make it back. Some came to dig. Some came at night with shovels and flashlights and greed overwhelming their instincts. Some came alone, some came in groups. None of it mattered. The tree took them all. A group of college kids in 1997 doing a documentary for a film class. They set up cameras around the tree, planned to dig at midnight, capture everything for their project. The cameras recorded for 3 hours showed the students digging, laughing, joking about the curse. Then at 12:47 a.m., all 6 cameras went dark at the same moment. When they were found the next day, the cameras were still running, but the footage from 12:47 onward showed nothing but static and occasional glimpses of shapes that might have been human or might have been branches or might have been something else entirely. The students were never found. Their car was still there, their equipment scattered around the base of the tree, the hole they'd been digging filled back in smooth and level. No bodies, no blood, no sign of struggle, just gone, like they'd been erased from the world. And the only evidence they'd ever existed was 3 hours of video footage that ended in static and screams. A treasure hunter in 2003, professional equipment and years of experience finding buried valuables. He came with ground-penetrating radar, with metal detectors, with the confidence of someone who'd successfully excavated dozens of sites. He found the gold immediately. The radar showed a massive deposit exactly where the legend said it would be. He started digging, working methodically, professionally, taking core samples to verify what he was finding. He called his wife that evening, excited, said he'd hit the mother lode, said he'd be home in 2 days with enough gold to retire on. His wife never heard from him again. When she drove out to Sable Creek a week later, she found his truck, his equipment, his tent, everything he'd brought except him. The core samples were there, sitting in labeled bags, and when she looked at them, she screamed and dropped them, because each sample, each carefully extracted cylinder of earth, contained not just dirt and rock, but bits of bone, human bone, fresh bone with tissue still attached, like it had been part of a living body minutes ago instead of buried for decades. The sheriff investigated, found nothing. Another missing person, another inexplicable disappearance, another case file that would gather dust in storage. The equipment was auctioned off eventually, bought by another treasure hunter who had no idea where it came from. That hunter started having nightmares after he brought it home, dreams of hanging, of ropes tightening, of a tree with twisted branches reaching down to grab him. He burned the equipment and the dream stopped. By the 2010 seconds, local authorities were getting concerned. Too many disappearances, too many strange incidents, too much attention from the wrong kind of people. They tried to fence off the area, put up warning signs, even stationed a deputy out there for a few weeks. But the fence kept getting cut, the signs kept disappearing, and the deputy requested a transfer after 2 weeks, saying he couldn't sleep with that tree in his jurisdiction, couldn't stop hearing the creak of rope when the wind blew. They talked about cutting the tree down, talked about it seriously, got estimates from tree services, even had a crew scheduled to do it. But the night before the job was supposed to happen, all 3 men on the crew had the same dream themselves, hanging from that tree, rope around their necks, struggling for air that wouldn't come. In the morning, they called and canceled. No amount of money was worth that tree. The legends grew with each disappearance, each strange occurrence, each unexplained event. The Gallows tree wasn't just guarding buried gold anymore. It had become something else, a predator, a trap, a thing with hunger and intelligence, actively luring people to it, actively claiming victims, actively growing its collection of bones and cursed coins. People reported seeing it move. Not the branches swaying in wind that's normal, but the branches reaching, extending, growing longer when someone got close, like the tree was trying to grab them, pull them in, add them to its hoard. Most people ran when they saw that. but some stood transfixed, unable to move, watching the branches come closer until someone else pulled them away, or until it was too late. People reported hearing voices. Not the wind through leaves, the tree had never had leaves, not in living memory, but voices, clear as day, calling out from the trunk or the roots or the branches. Sometimes the voices were pleading, begging for help, saying they were trapped and needed rescue. Sometimes the voices were threatening, promising death to anyone who came close. And sometimes this was the worst, the voices were your own, your voice calling out to you, telling you to come closer, telling you that the gold was real and waiting and yours for the taking. People who camped near the tree reported time anomalies, losing hours they couldn't account for or gaining time that shouldn't exist. They'd set up their tent at sunset, blink, and it would be dawn. Or they'd arrive at noon, set up camp, and realize only 5 minutes had passed, even though they'd swear it had been hours. The tree was bending reality around itself, creating a bubble where normal rules didn't apply, where the boundary between the living world and wherever the dead go had worn thin as paper, and the coins kept appearing, more of them now, scattered across 3 states, each one a hook with gold instead of steel. The tree was fishing, patient and persistent, casting its lures into the world and waiting for someone to bite. And people kept biting, because greed is a constant, and desperation never goes away, and there's always someone who thinks they're smarter than everyone who came before. Local folklore started to change, started to treat the tree not as a curiosity or a mystery, but as something to actively avoid, to warn children away from, to cross yourself when you mentioned it. The old Mexican tradition of making offerings to dangerous spirits, food, tobacco, coins of regular currency, people started doing that at the tree, leaving gifts at its base, asking it to be satisfied, begging it not to reach out and take anyone else. Whether the tree cared about offerings is debatable, but sometimes the gifts would disappear overnight. Sometimes they'd be found scattered around the base in patterns that looked almost like letters, almost like words, almost like the tree was trying to communicate, but nobody could read what it was saying, and nobody really wanted to try. Urban legends grew up around the tree, detached from the original story. Kids would dare each other to touch the bark, to stand under the branches at midnight, to say Mason Cord's name 3 times in front of the trunk. Most of them chickened out. The ones who didn't sometimes came back changed, quiet, withdrawn, having dreams they wouldn't talk about, seeing things at the edges of their vision that weren't there when they looked directly. A few of them disappeared, just stopped coming to school one day, stopped showing up at home. Their parents would find them eventually, or find what was left of them, always near the tree, always with that look on their faces, that expression of terminal terror, that knowledge that whatever they'd seen in their last moments was beyond anything the human mind could process and remain intact. The tree became a boogeyman, a thing parents threatened children with. Behave or the gallows tree will get you. Don't stay out late or you'll end up hanging from the dead tree. Stories that were meant to be disciplined tools but had too much truth underneath, and too much reality lurking behind the threats. And through it all, the tree stood, unchanged by time, unaffected by weather, immune to every attempt to contain or explain or destroy it. Its branches reached toward the sky like accusations. Its roots reached down into the earth like anchors, holding on to cursed gold and the bones of everyone who'd tried to claim it. Its bark stayed dark as sin, its rope scars stayed fresh as yesterday, its presence stayed wrong in a way that defied explanation but couldn't be denied. The tree stood, and the tree waited, and the tree grew its legend with every fool who came looking for gold and found something else instead. With every disappearance and every strange occurrence and every coin that appeared in unexpected places, the legend grew. And with every retelling, with every warning ignored, with every fool who thought the curse didn't apply to them, the tree grew stronger. Because that's what curses do. They feed, they grow. They get hungrier with every meal, more powerful with every victim, more determined with every failed attempt to stop them. The gallows tree had been feeding for over a century now, had claimed dozens or hundreds of victims, had accumulated power that went beyond anything natural or explainable. It wasn't just a tree anymore. Maybe it never had been. It was a portal, a gateway, a thing that stood between the world of the living and whatever dark place the vengeful dead inhabit. It was three outlaws' rage given form and permanence, their determination to protect their gold transformed into something that would outlast empires and outlive civilizations. And it was still waiting, still hungry, still patient as death, and twice as certain, because there's always another fool, always someone who hears the warnings and thinks they don't apply, always someone desperate enough or greedy enough or just plain unlucky enough to find a coin, to hear the story, to decide that maybe, just maybe, they'll be the exception. The tree knows this. The tree counts on it. The tree will still be standing 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, long after Sable Creek is dust, and the memory of the Old West has faded completely. The tree will still be there, dark and twisted and wrong, with its hoard buried deep and its hunger never satisfied, still swinging, even when there's nothing hanging there, still creaking, even in windless air, still calling out to fools who think they're clever, who think curses aren't real, who think the gold is worth any price, still waiting for the next victim, still fishing with coins of cursed gold, still adding names to the metal and bones to the hoard and souls to the collection of the damned, the gallows tree, standing alone in an empty field where a ghost town used to be, guarding fortune that costs more than it's worth, claiming fools who should have known better, forever. The fire's about burned down now, friend. Just coals glowing in the darkness, giving off more memory of heat than actual warmth. The night's gotten deep and cold, the kind of desert cold that reminds you how thin the line is between the living world and the empty places between stars. Somewhere out there in that darkness, coyotes are calling to each other, trading information that we can't understand, speaking in a language older than human words. And somewhere else out there, further than the coyotes, but not as far as you'd hope, the gallows tree is standing, always waiting, patient as stone and hungrier than time. I've told you the story now, start to finish. Told you about Mason Cord and his partners, about the gold they buried and the rope that found them anyway. Told you about all the fools who came after Abel and Beck and Carter Hayes and all the rest whose names got lost but whose faces got stamped on cursed coins. Told you about the tree itself, about how it grew from just wood and bark into something else, something darker, something that feeds on greed and fear in equal measure. But the real story, the one under all the other stories, that's about something simpler, something older, something that don't change no matter how much time passes or how modern we think we've become. It's about the weight of what we bury. See, those three outlaws, they thought they were being clever, thought they'd found the perfect hiding place, the one spot nobody would ever think to dig, and they were right, in a way. They'd found a place that scared people, that made folks reluctant to disturb the ground, that was protected by superstition and respect for the dead. But what they didn't count on, what nobody ever counts on, is that some things are meant to stay buried, not because they're sacred or valuable or dangerous, but because burying something changes it, changes what it is, changes what it means, changes how it interacts with the world. Gold by itself is just metal, pretty metal, sure, valuable metal, absolutely. But at the end of the day, it's just atoms arranged in a particular way, and it don't have memory or intention or power beyond what we give it. But gold buried by dying men, gold hidden in the shadow of a hanging tree, gold that's lain in the earth mixing with bones and rage and the last desperate thoughts of criminals facing their death, that gold becomes something else, becomes a focus point for all that dark energy, becomes a battery storing up violence and greed and the particular poison that comes from dying before your time. And the tree was just a tree once, cottonwood, probably been standing there for a century before the first hanging, just growing slow and patient like trees do, minding its own business, turning water and sun into wood and bark and leaves. But use a tree for hanging enough times, string up enough desperate men from its branches, Let enough blood and fear and final prayers soak into its roots, and the tree changes too, absorbs all that death, becomes marked by it, stained by it, transformed by it, until it ain't just a tree anymore, but a monument to violence, a memorial to all the worst things humans do to each other. Put the cursed gold and the hanging tree together, bury the one under the roots of the other, and you've got something that's more than the sum of its parts. You've got a thing with power, a thing with hunger, a thing that reaches out into the world looking for more victims, more bones, more souls to add to its collection. That's what those outlaws created, whether they meant to or not. They thought they were just hiding their fortune, but what they actually did was plant a seed of darkness that's been growing ever since, feeding on every fool who comes looking, getting stronger with every victim, spreading its roots deeper into the earth and its branches wider across the sky. And here's the thing that keeps me up at night, that makes me tell this story even though I know most people won't believe it. The tree ain't unique. Out there in the desert, scattered across the frontier, hidden in forgotten corners of the West, there's other places like this. Other sites where violence and greed and death got concentrated down to their essence and left to ferment in the ground. Other hanging trees, other massacre sites, other places where enough bad things happened in one spot that the land itself got poisoned. Most of them are forgotten now. The trees got cut down or died on their own. The towns around them disappeared. The stories faded until they were just local legends, half-remembered warnings that nobody takes seriously anymore. But the poison's still there, buried deep, waiting for someone to disturb it. The gallows tree is just the one that never let folks forget. The one that stayed hungry enough and active enough to keep claiming victims, to keep adding to its legend, to keep warning people away while simultaneously luring them in. It's the exception, maybe. But exceptions prove the rule. And the rule is this: some places are cursed, some ground is poisoned, some things are meant to stay buried forever. Gold don't shine forever, like I said at the start, but guilt, rage, the particular stain that comes from dying violent and unrepentant, that's got its own kind of glow. One that don't fade with time, don't diminish with distance, don't do nothing but burn brighter the longer it's left alone. I ain't telling you this story to entertain you, though I hope it does that too. I'm telling you this as a warning. Because somewhere out there, maybe in a pawn shop or a parking lot or just sitting on the side of a road, there's a coin waiting. A small black coin with a face stamped on it that don't look quite right, with metal that feels colder than it should, with weight that's more than just physical. And if you find that coin when you find it, because the tree's still fishing, and eventually everybody gets a hook thrown at them, I want you to remember this story. Want you to remember old Mason Cord standing under those branches with a rope around his neck, saying that whoever finds the gold will wish they hadn't. Want you to remember all the fools who thought the warnings didn't apply to them, thought they were smarter or luckier or more deserving than everyone who came before. Want you to remember that some fortunes cost more than they're worth, that some prices are too high to pay, that some treasures carry weight that ain't measured in coin. And I want you to leave that coin where you found it. Walk away, drive away, run away if you have to, because picking it up means you've taken the bait. And once that hook is set, the tree starts reeling you in, slow or fast, direct or roundabout. It don't matter. The tree's patient. The tree's got all the time in the world, and the tree always, always gets what it's fishing for. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking that if you found that gold, you'd be smart about it. You'd take just enough to make a difference, leave the rest. Or you'd sell it quick, get rid of it before the curse could take hold. Or you'd donate it to charity, use the cursed gold for good works, somehow balance the scales and avoid the price. But it don't work that way. The curse ain't in the using of the gold, it's in the taking of it. The moment you touch that metal with intention to keep it, with greed in your heart, even if it's reasonable greed, justified greed, desperate greed, that moment, you're marked. That moment, you're part of the horde. That moment, the tree owns you, and the tree always collects what it's owed, so leave it buried. Let the gold sleep under the gallows tree, mixed with bones and rage and a century of bad decisions. Let the tree stand in its empty field, warning folks away just by existing, by being so obviously wrong that even people who don't believe in curses know to stay clear. Some treasures are meant to be found. Some mysteries are meant to be solved. Some stories have happy endings, but this ain't one of those stories. This is a story about the price of greed, about the weight of guilt, about what happens when violence and death and desperate last acts get concentrated down and left to poison the ground. This is a story about a tree that learned to hunger, about gold that learned to curse, about 3 dead outlaws who won't let go of their fortune even though they've been in the ground for over a century. This is a story about staying away from places where the wrong thing happened too many times in the same spot, about respecting warnings even when you don't fully understand them, about acknowledging that there's things in this world that don't make sense, don't follow rules, don't respond to science or reason or any of the tools we use to make ourselves feel safe. The fire's dead now, just ashes and memory. The night's at its deepest, that hour before dawn when the darkness feels permanent and the cold gets into your bones and staying makes you wonder if morning will ever come. Time to move on, friend. Time to head back to whatever warm place you call home. Time to leave this empty field and this old story and the darkness that's pressing in from all sides. And if you ever find yourself near Sable Creek, near the ruins of that ghost town, near that empty field where a tree stands alone, keep driving. Don't stop. Don't investigate. Don't think that maybe you'll be the exception, the one who takes the gold and walks away clean, because the gallows tree is still there, still standing, still guarding its hoard, still fishing with cursed coins and reeling in fools, still hungry after all these years, still patient after all this time, still waiting with the certainty that comes from never being denied. The rope still swings in windless air, the branches still reach for passing souls, the coins still whisper names in the darkness, and somewhere under those roots, mixed with the bones of everyone who tried and failed to claim the fortune, $40,000 in cursed gold waits to be found, but not by you, not if you're smart. Not if you're listening to an old man's warning around a dying fire on a cold desert night. Some fortunes are meant to stay buried. Some trees are meant to stand alone. Some warnings are meant to be heeded, not tested. The gallows tree stands in Sable Creek. The gold sleeps beneath its roots. And the dead men wait with patience that'll outlast mountains and outlive stars. Let them wait. Let them guard their treasure. Let them swing in their invisible ropes and whisper in their voiceless voices and hunger in their endless hunger, because taking what they're guarding, that ain't wealth, that's damnation, and no amount of gold is worth the price they'll make you pay. Good night, friend. Drive safe. And if you see a coin on the side of the road, walk on by. Just walk on by. Some things are better left alone.